Greetings everyone. This is Vision Harry. Prepare yourselves for. Kingsley filed 2 reports after seeing Harry at Privet Drive. Only one was addressed to Dumbledore. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The second report. The night Kingsley Shacklebolt drew the short straw for Privet Drive duty, it was raining. Not dramatically, not the kind of rain that announces itself with lightning and makes people feel things. Just Surrey rain, thin and persistent and grey even at midnight, the kind that soaks through robes before you've noticed it started. He'd apparat to the corner of Magnolia Crescent at 12:05 and stood there for a moment with his hood up, getting his bearings, running through the routine checks he'd done on this street more times than he could count. Wards intact. No unusual magical signatures. No disturbances in the Muggle sleep patterns he'd learned to read like a sixth sense after 15 years as an Auror, that particular quality of suburban stillness that meant everyone on the street was exactly where they were supposed to be. Number 4 was dark. Ground floor, first floor, all dark. The Ford Anglia, which wasn't a Ford Anglia, wasn't a car at all, but a surveillance blind that Mad Eye had built into the hedge opposite, showed nothing on its modified mirrors. Kingsley walked the perimeter anyway, because that was the job, and because Alastair Moody had once told him that the night you skip the perimeter is the night something uses that against you. He was halfway down the back alley that ran behind the garden walls of Privet Drive when he heard it. Not a sound, exactly. More an absence of sound, the rain going quiet in a small circle, like something was redirecting it. Kingsley stopped walking. His hand moved to his wand without thought, 15 years of aura reflex operating independently of his brain, and he stood absolutely still and listened. Then he heard the exhale. Controlled. Measured. The breath of someone in physical exertion who had trained themselves not to make noise. He moved to the wall, the low garden wall of number 4, damp brick under his palms, and looked over. Harry Potter was standing in the middle of the garden in the rain, and he was working. Kingsley's first thought was practical and immediate, the boy wasn't using a wand. His second thought arrived a half-second later, quieter and more significant, he hasn't noticed me. Which meant Harry was either deeply absorbed or deliberately ignoring him, and Kingsley had enough experience reading people to know which one it was. He watched. There were 6 objects arranged in a loose semicircle in the grass, a stone, a length of wood, a ceramic pot, 2 Muggle paperback books, and what looked like a tin mug. They were all hovering. Not hovering dramatically, not wobbling with the effort of it, hovering steadily, rotating slowly in a way that suggested Harry had been maintaining this for some time. While he talked. Not to Kingsley. To himself. Quietly, in a voice that had the flat, rehearsed quality of someone drilling through a problem they've already thought about too much. Counter to reducto when the caster's left-handed, Harry said, barely above a murmur, is a quarter step right, shield angled, not straight, angled, and return with the blasting curse rather than deflection. Deflection against a left-handed reducto sends it back at the wrong angle. He paused. The tin mug rose a foot higher than the other objects and rotated faster. Bellatrix is ambidextrous. Have to account for that. Kingsley stayed very still. Dolahov's signature is the purple flame. He doesn't vary it because he doesn't have to, most people can't block it cleanly. The block is an obscure one. Harry's voice went a little quieter, and when it came back it had an edge to it that wasn't anger, exactly. More like a whetstone. Hermione couldn't block it. I can. I've been practicing. He moved then, a sharp pivot, arm out, no wand, and the stone flew from its hover position directly at the ceramic pot, which shattered into 4 pieces mid-air before reassembling itself. Harry caught the stone one-handed without looking. That's the sequence, he said quietly, satisfied with something. The reassembly takes less time now. Kingsley realized his mouth was slightly open and closed it. He'd seen prodigies before. He'd worked alongside prodigies, trained them, assessed them, filed reports on them for the Auror office that used words like exceptional and recommend for advanced fast track. He knew what talented looked like. He knew what very talented looked like. This wasn't any of those categories. What he was watching in this dark, wet garden at midnight was something he didn't have a clean word for, something that lived in the space between talent and transformation. Harry hadn't broken a sweat. The objects were still hovering, all 5 remaining ones, while he stood in the rain and thought about Bellatrix Lestrange's dueling habits with the focused dispassion of a chess player reviewing a game he intends to win next time. Kingsley made a decision. He put his wand away. Then he cleared his throat. Harry didn't spin around. Didn't flinch. The objects lowered smoothly to the ground, not dropped, placed, and he turned to face the wall with the kind of calm that told Kingsley he'd known exactly how long someone had been standing there. "Kingsley," Harry said. "Not a question." "Harry." Kingsley pulled himself over the wall. It lacked a certain dignity, being a large man in wet robes climbing a garden wall, but he managed it without disaster. He landed on the grass and straightened up. "Your perimeter awareness could use work. I've been there 3 minutes. 2, Harry said. And I knew it was you. Your disillusionment charm has a color to it, slightly gold on the edges. It's the way you cast it." He paused. "I noticed it the first time you were on duty here. 6 weeks ago." Kingsley looked at him. Harry looked back. The rain continued its indifferent business. He was thinner than he'd been at the ministry. That was the first thing, the sharp lines of his face that hadn't been there in June, the way his clothes fit differently, looser in some places and wrong in others, like he'd lost weight fast and it hadn't redistributed yet. But his eyes were clear. Not the eyes of someone who'd been sleeping badly and eating poorly and falling apart in a bedroom for 8 weeks, which was what the reports, Dumbledore's reports, the ones compiled from various Order members' observations, had described. Those eyes were focused and a little cold and entirely present. "How long have you been out here tonight?" Kingsley asked. "Since about 11. Harry looked at the objects on the ground, then back up. "I usually train from 11 to 3. Sometimes later if I'm working on something specific." "Every night?" "Every night since I got home." Kingsley absorbed this. "Your uncle doesn't object?" Something flickered across Harry's face, not quite a smile, not quite contempt, a compressed version of both. "My uncle hasn't come outside after dark since the 2nd week. He looked out the window once and went straight back to bed. I think he's decided that whatever I'm doing, he'd rather not know." "Smart man." "First time I've ever thought so." Kingsley walked across the wet grass and looked at the objects Harry had been levitating. Up close, the books had handwriting in the margins, small, cramped, multiple colors of ink. Not Harry's own notes. Older handwriting, faded in places. He picked one up and read the spine. Advanced Combat Transfiguration, Theory and Practice. 3rd edition, 1943. The author's name had been half obscured by a charm that had faded with the book's age, leaving only the initials, S.O.B. Sirius's, Harry said, from somewhere behind him. "Not explaining. Just identifying. From Grimmauld Place. I took what I could carry before we left." There were books in his room, books he'd hidden, actually, behind a false back in the wardrobe. Not the dark stuff. Training books. Dueling theory. A lot of his father's old Auror notes. Harry picked up the tin mug from the grass. "He never told me about them. I don't know if he was going to." The sentence ended without drama and without performance. No catch in the voice. No pause to signal that this was painful. It was more unnerving than grief would have been, somehow, this clean acknowledgement of a wound that had been set and bandaged and was now simply a scar that occasionally pulled. He would have, Kingsley said, because it was true. "Yeah." Harry set the mug down on the low garden table near the back wall. "I know." Kingsley put the book down. "Show me what you were working on." Harry turned to look at him. "I thought you were here to guard the perimeter." I have a monitoring charm on the perimeter. It'll alert me if anything with a dark signature comes within 200 meters. You think Voldemort's Death Eaters are going to announce themselves? Something changed in Harry's posture, infinitesimally, but Kingsley caught it. He'd used the name. Most people still didn't. Most people still did that small, involuntary flinch even after Dumbledore had been making a point of saying it for years. Kingsley had simply never seen the point of the flinch. Names were names, fear dressed them up in importance they didn't inherently have. You said Voldemort, Harry said. I always do. Most people on the Order don't. Most people on the Order, Kingsley said, do a lot of things I find counterproductive. He nodded at the space in the garden. Go on, then. Show me. Harry watched him for a moment, not suspiciously, exactly, but with the calculating look of someone deciding how much to invest in a situation. Then he moved back to the center of the garden and the 6 objects rose from the ground. This time Kingsley watched properly, the way he'd learned to watch in Auror training, not at the obvious thing, but at everything surrounding it. He watched Harry's breathing, his stance, the micro-expressions that crossed his face as he worked. He watched the objects and the precision of their movement and the density of the magic holding them, which he could feel even at 5 meters away, a low pressure in the air like weather building. The reassembly, Harry said, and the ceramic pot exploded into fragments and came back together in under a second, is the useful part. The levitation is just the mechanism for practicing split attention. He glanced at Kingsley. In a real fight, you have to be able to maintain one thing, a shield, a concealment, a binding on something, while you're doing something else entirely. Most people can't. They drop one to do the other. His hand moved. The stone separated from the group and began moving in a completely different pattern from the others. I can hold 5 independent movements with different properties while casting separately. Working on 6. Kingsley said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. What Harry had just described was a skill that Auror spent years developing, that some of them never fully developed, that required not just magical power but a specific kind of cognitive architecture that you either had or spent a career trying to cultivate. And the wandless work, Kingsley said carefully. It's limited. I can do it for anything I've done wandlessly before, accidental magic I've intentionally reconstructed. I can't do new spells wandlessly yet, not reliably. The levitation is solid. So is the shield. Harry let the objects down. I've been working on Expelliarmus wandlessly. If I can get that, really get it, not just occasionally, then I can disarm someone who's taken my wand, which happens. His jaw tightened briefly. It's happened. Graveyard, Kingsley said. Graveyard. Department of Mysteries. He looked up. Lucius Malfoy had my wand for about 30 seconds in the Ministry. 30 seconds is a long time. Kingsley thought about what to say next and chose honesty, because in his experience it was usually the most respectful option. How long have you been operating at this level without anyone knowing? Harry's expression was interesting, a flicker of something that might have been dark amusement. Since 4th year, mostly. 3rd year I was starting to figure out what I could actually do. By the end of 4th year I had a clearer picture. He sat down on the garden table, easy and unself-conscious. The problem was that no one ever really trained me specifically. I learned what Hogwarts taught, same as everyone. But the things I figured out on my own, no one ever looked at them. No one knew to look. Except Sirius. Sirius knew I was more capable than most people thought. He encouraged it. But we didn't have much time. A pause. Lupin knew some of it. He saw more than he let on, I think. But he never pushed Dumbledore on it. Kingsley leaned against the wall. The rain had thinned to almost nothing now, a fine mist. And what is it you think Dumbledore doesn't know? The question landed and Harry sat with it for a moment. When he answered, his voice had a quality Kingsley had only heard from experienced field operatives, the particular precision of someone who has thought about a thing so many times they've stripped it down to its essential structure. He knows I'm capable, Harry said. He thinks he knows the extent of it. He doesn't. And he's operating on a timeline that involves waiting until he thinks I'm ready, which means he controls the information I get and the training I receive and the decisions I'm allowed to make. He looked directly at Kingsley. He means well. I genuinely believe that. But the effect is the same whether the intention is good or not. I'm being managed. It was, Kingsley thought, one of the clearest and most unsentimental analyses he'd heard from someone 3 times Harry's age. And you have a problem with that, he said. Wouldn't you? Yes, Kingsley said simply. I would. They were quiet for a moment. Somewhere on the street a car went past, headlights sweeping briefly over the garden wall and vanishing. Normal world conducting normal business, entirely unaware. There's something else, Harry said. He picked up the book with SOB's initials on the spine and turned it over in his hands. I've been thinking about the prophecy. The full version, the one Dumbledore told me. He looked up. I think there's more to it than either of us understands yet. The neither can live while the other survives part is obvious enough. But the power the Dark Lord knows not, everyone assumes that's love. Dumbledore talks about love like it's an answer. His voice didn't quite manage neutrality here, there was a fine edge to it. But I think the power is something else. Something more specific. And whatever it is, I'm not going to figure it out by sitting in this garden. No, Kingsley agreed. You're not. I need to get back to Grimmauld Place. Back to the library. Back to people I can actually work with. He set the book down. Dumbledore's going to move me there in 2 weeks, according to what Mrs. Weasley let slip in her last letter. I think I should probably let that happen on schedule and not telegraph that I know. Makes things easier. Kingsley looked at him steadily. You're planning around Dumbledore. I'm planning with incomplete information, which is what he's given me. Harry met his eyes. I'm not working against him. I just can't afford to only work through him. This was the moment, Kingsley knew. He'd reached the point where a choice was being made without being named as a choice, the way consequential decisions often worked, the moment where you either took a step or you didn't, and the taking or not taking defined something about you that couldn't be undone. He thought about the order meetings he'd sat through, watching Dumbledore parcel information like a man dealing cards from a deck only he could see. He thought about Sirius, who had died in a trap that better information might have prevented. He thought about 15 years of filing Auror reports and the strange discipline of writing one version of the truth for an official file and knowing a fuller version lived only in your own head. He thought about the boy in front of him, who had been fighting this war since he was 11 months old and who had never once, as far as Kingsley could see, been given what he actually needed. I file a report after every guard duty, Kingsley said. It goes to Dumbledore, through the Order's secure communication channel. Harry waited. After this evening, Kingsley said, I'll file one of those. He paused. I'll also write a second document. Which will not go to Dumbledore. The silence stretched out between them, rain-thin and significant. Who does it go to? Harry asked. Right now? No one. It goes into a secured file that only I can access. Kingsley looked at him steadily. Eventually, it goes where it needs to go. I haven't decided all of that yet. But what I will not do is write a report that reduces what I saw tonight to the subject appeared well and move on. Something shifted in Harry's face, not relief, exactly. More like the specific, private satisfaction of someone who has been waiting a long time to be seen accurately. Why? Harry asked. Not challenging. Genuinely wanting to know. Kingsley thought about it. Because I'm an Auror. Because the purpose of an Auror is to protect people and pursue the truth, in that order, and sometimes those things are in conflict with institutional preferences. He pushed off the wall. And because you reminded me of something just now. What? That the best soldiers I've ever known, Kingsley said, were never the ones who waited for permission. Harry looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, small, the nod of someone filing something away carefully. I'm going inside, Harry said, gathering the books from the garden table. The neighbors have a dog that starts barking at about 2:30. Wakes me up if I'm still out here. He paused. Thanks for not pretending you didn't see. Thank you, Kingsley said, for the color observation about my disillusionment charm. I'll work on that. Harry almost smiled. It was interesting, what almost smiling looked like on a face that had been doing so little of it, quick and lopsided and gone before it fully arrived, like a match being struck and immediately covered. Then he went inside, and the back door of number 4 Privet Drive clicked shut behind him, and Kingsley was alone in the wet garden with the mist and the quiet and the weight of what he'd just decided. He stood there for a while. Then he walked back to the alley and finished his perimeter check, because the job was still the job. He filed the first report at 4 a.m. from the safe house on Marchmont Street, sitting at the narrow desk in the spare room with a silencing charm on the walls and a cup of tea going cold beside him. The report was professional, thorough, and carefully constructed. It described the guard rotation, the state of the property's protective enchantments, the absence of any dark magical activity in the surrounding area. It noted that Harry Potter had been observed moving around the property's grounds at approximately midnight, appeared to be in reasonable physical health, showed no signs of extreme emotional distress. It recommended continuing the current guard schedule. Every word of it was true. He read it over once, tapped it with his wand to encrypt it with the order's standard cipher, and set it aside. Then he uncapped a fresh ink bottle, took a clean roll of parchment, and began to write the second report. This one had no header. No cipher, no official format. It was written in his own shorthand, the private notation system he developed in his first year as a field auror and never taught to anyone, not because he was secretive by nature but because he'd learned early that keeping a private honest record was different in kind from keeping an official one, and the distinction mattered. H.P., Privet Drive, August 2nd. He wrote. What I actually saw. He wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. He wrote about the wandless levitation and the precision of the split attention casting. He wrote about the books, SOB's initials, the third edition of the 1943 combat transfiguration text, the marginal notes that suggested years of serious field application. He wrote about Harry's analysis of Bellatrix Lestrange's ambidexterity, Dolohhov's signature curse, Lucius Malfoy's disarmament of him in the ministry. He wrote about the calm in Harry's voice when he talked about Sirius's books, the specific quality of it, not suppressed grief but processed grief, the kind that has been metabolized into something else. He wrote, he is operating as a field asset without support infrastructure. The difference between what he's doing and what the Order thinks he's doing is not a small gap, it's a chasm. He is doing his own strategic analysis, his own practical training, his own intelligence assessment. He has been doing this in isolation for at least 2 years, probably longer. He paused and drank some cold tea and kept writing. The Dumbledore report, the real one, the one I can't file with the Order, is this: he's not behind. He's ahead. Dumbledore is managing a timeline built around a version of Harry Potter that stopped being accurate approximately 3 years ago. The boy has grown past the plan without anyone noticing. He set the quill down and looked at what he'd written. Outside, London was doing what London did in the very early morning, the first distant sounds of delivery vehicles, the grey lightning in the east, the city gathering itself for another day. I don't know yet what the right move is with this information. He wrote. I don't know who else should see it, or when. What I know is that the moment I walked away from that garden pretending I'd seen nothing, I would have become part of the problem. I've met too many people who became part of the problem that way, one deliberate non-seeing at a time, until the habit was so deep they couldn't find their way back to honesty. He said, I think the power is something more specific than love. He said it the way people say things they've been thinking about alone for a long time. He's been working on the prophecy in isolation. That's either brilliance or danger, and I think it might be both. What he needs: access to better resources, genuine tactical partnership, at least one person on the order side who gives him information straight rather than curated. What he doesn't need: another adult deciding they know better and proceeding accordingly. He paused again. Looked at the growing light in the window. One more thing, he wrote. Before I left, I watched him go inside and I looked at the garden, at where he'd been standing. He'd been out there long enough to leave clear impressions in the wet grass. Footwork patterns. Evasion sequences, from the layout of them, the weight distribution in the impressions. He's been drilling physical combat evasion as well. Not hexes and spells. Body movement. Sirius Black taught him something before he died, or he figured it out himself. Either way, he's not preparing to survive this war. He's preparing to win it. He held the quill over the parchment for another moment, then added, below the last line, the question I keep returning to is this: when the right person to show this to walks into the picture, and they will, am I going to recognize them, or am I going to hesitate because it's inconvenient? I've spent 15 years hesitating because it was inconvenient. I'm done with that. He rolled the parchment, sealed it with a charm only he could break, and tucked it inside the hidden compartment of his aura field kit alongside a collection of personal notes, private records, and one small black notebook that he'd been keeping since his first year, the record of everything he'd seen that hadn't made it into official reports, the history of what the ministry pretended wasn't happening. He added Harry Potter to that history. Not as a subject. Not as an asset or a case number or a protected individual. As an operative. Then he took his cold tea to the window and watched the sun come up over London, thinking about the distance between what people were told and what was true, and what it cost, in the long run, in the very long run, to confuse one for the other. He thought about Sirius, who had died in part because of that confusion. Who had spent 12 years in prison because the people with the authority to investigate had chosen institutional efficiency over truth. Who had spent the last years of his life in a house he hated because the people in charge of protecting him had decided their version of safety was the only one that counted. He thought about Harry saying, calm as still water, he means well. I genuinely believe that. But the effect is the same whether the intention is good or not. 15 years as an Auror. 7 years watching the Order build and rebuild and burn down and rebuild again. And a 16-year-old in a wet garden had articulated the central problem of every institution Kingsley had ever worked within more cleanly than any senior operative he'd encountered. He drained the cold tea. Grimaced at the temperature. Put the cup down. Right, he thought. Time to figure out what to do about that. He operated back to Grimmauld Place just as the first Weasley started moving in the kitchen above, and he did not sleep, and he did not file any further reports, and he carried the sealed parchment with him like a decision that hadn't finished making itself yet, which was, he supposed, exactly what it was. The second report waited. The war did not. Chapter 2, What the Order Doesn't Know. Grimmauld Place hadn't changed. That was the thing Kingsley always noticed, coming back to it, the way the house resisted change the way old things sometimes did, not through preservation but through a kind of aggressive stasis, like it had decided on a personality somewhere around 1890 and wasn't interested in revising. The dark wallpaper. The smell of old wood and something herbal and slightly wrong underneath it. The portrait of Walburga Black in the hallway, currently covered by a heavy curtain that did precisely nothing to muffle her if she decided to start screaming, which she did with reliable malice whenever the curtain shifted. He arrived through the back entrance, the narrow passage from the kitchen garden that the Order used for arrivals and departures to minimize disturbance on the street, and found Molly Weasley already at the stove at 7:30, which meant she'd either not slept or had slept 2 hours and decided that was enough. She looked at him over her shoulder, took in his wet robes and the particular expression he'd spent the apparition trip trying to neutralize, and turned back to the stove without comment. "Tea's fresh," she said. "Meeting's at 9. I know. Thank you. Harry?" "Fine. Sleeping." He said it automatically and it was, technically, true. Harry would be sleeping by now, if his training schedule ran 11 to 3. Molly accepted it with the slight tension around her eyes that she always had when Harry's name came up, the expression of a woman who was holding a very large amount of worry in a space that wasn't quite big enough for it and had learned to contain the overflow through constant motion. Kingsley took his tea to the small room at the end of the hall that the Order used as a staging area between meetings, a Spartan space with 2 chairs and a table covered in rolled maps and surveillance logs, and sat down and thought about what he was going to say in 2 hours. The answer, he'd decided somewhere over central London, was, as little as possible. Not because he intended to deceive the Order. Because he had learned, over the years, that there was a meaningful difference between information that was ready to be shared and information that needed to develop further before sharing it could do anything other than create problems. What he had seen in Harry's garden was significant but incomplete. He knew what he'd observed. He didn't yet know the full shape of what it meant. Taking it into a room full of people, half of whom would immediately want to report everything to Dumbledore, and the other half of whom would want to argue about what it meant for 45 minutes, was not, at present, the right move. He drank his tea and reviewed the Order's surveillance logs from the past week, and he waited. By 9 o'clock the kitchen was full. The Order of the Phoenix in full assembly was a specific and slightly chaotic experience that Kingsley had spent 3 years trying to accurately characterize and had finally settled on passionate but procedurally weak. The people in the room were, individually, formidable, Moody with his magical eye rotating slowly in its socket, tracking 4 directions at once, Lupin, quiet in the corner, reading something and pretending not to listen to every conversation simultaneously, the Weasley twins, who were technically not Order members but had perfected the art of being physically present in a way that was very difficult to object to. Tonks, who had arrived in Kingsley's preferred chair and was now wearing a Weasley jumper she'd borrowed at some point and looked entirely unapologetic about it. Arthur Weasley managed the seating arrangement with the good-natured efficiency of a man who had organized 6 children at a dinner table for 20 years. Hestia Jones arrived exactly on time and sat precisely where she always sat and had the expression of someone who had already decided what she thought before anything had been said. Dumbledore arrived last. He always arrived last. Kingsley had long ago decided this wasn't coincidence, it was composition, the subtle management of a room's energy that Dumbledore did as naturally as breathing, the way an orchestral conductor could change the temperature of a space simply by walking through the door. When he sat at the head of the table, the room settled. Conversations finished themselves. People straightened imperceptibly. Kingsley watched this happen and felt the familiar dual response, genuine respect for the skill of it, and a cold clarity about what the skill was for. "Thank you all for coming," Dumbledore said, which was what he always said, and adjusted his half-moon spectacles, which was what he always did, and looked around the table with those blue eyes that could make you feel simultaneously seen and assessed. "Before we begin, I'd like to hear from those who were on rotation this week. Mundungus, I believe you were at the Ministry premises on Tuesday." And so it began. Mundungus reported on a surveillance operation in terms so vague they barely constituted information, and Dumbledore listened with every appearance of careful attention and extracted 3 useful facts from the fog by asking precise questions. Hestia reported a Death Eater sighting in Nocturne Alley, possible, not confirmed, 1 witness with a history of drink. Lupin reported from his werewolf intelligence network in terms he was careful to keep general, which meant Fenrir Greyback's pack movements were significant enough that Lupin was protecting his sources even in this room. Kingsley registered all of this and also registered what was being done with it. Each piece of information, as it came in, was processed by Dumbledore in a way that was, and this was the thing that had been quietly troubling Kingsley for 2 years, almost entirely opaque. Dumbledore received. Dumbledore responded. What he did with what he received, how it connected to other information he held, where it fit in whatever larger picture he was working from, none of that was shared. The Order gave. Dumbledore kept. And this arrangement was so natural, so long established, so entangled with the genuine trust everyone in the room had in the man, that most of the people at the table had stopped noticing it was an arrangement at all. Moody had noticed. Moody always noticed everything. But Moody had his own complicated loyalty to Dumbledore that went back further than anyone else's and expressed itself in a particular kind of gruff, unconditional backing that he'd have died before calling anything so soft as devotion. Lupin had noticed. Lupin was too intelligent not to. But Lupin's position in the Order, his awareness of his own perceived status as a dark creature, the guilt and grief that followed him everywhere, all of it combined into a disposition toward deference that he probably would have characterized as wisdom and Kingsley thought was something more like a long habit of making himself smaller than he was. "Kingsley," Dumbledore said, and Kingsley brought his attention fully forward. "Your report from last night." 12 faces turned toward him. Molly Weasley's hands stilled on her teacup. Kingsley set down his own cup. "Guard rotation was uneventful," he said. "The protective enchantments on the property are intact and I found no evidence of surveillance or attempted incursion in the surrounding area. Harry was awake when I arrived, which isn't unusual given the time of year. He let a small pause develop, not long enough to be meaningful to anyone but himself. He appeared well. No acute distress, no signs of concerning behavior. I'd say he's managing." The room released a collective breath it had been holding without knowing it. "Good," Molly said, quietly, mostly to herself. "Thank you, Kingsley," Dumbledore said. His eyes rested on Kingsley for precisely 1 second longer than they rested on anyone else, which was either Kingsley's imagination or a signal, and he had found, over the years, that when it came to Albus Dumbledore the answer was usually signal. The meeting continued. It moved, as Order meetings always did, through a complicated rhythm of genuine urgency, political frustration, and interpersonal friction. The Ministry was still publicly dismissing Voldemort's return as a fiction, though the cracks in that fiction were spreading, too many disappearances, too many Aurors going quiet about what they were seeing in the field. Scrimgeour, who had replaced Fudge in all but title at this point, was playing a longer game than Fudge had but wasn't playing it honestly, and this occupied 20 minutes of increasingly tense discussion. Kingsley contributed where he had to, held back where he could, and spent a significant portion of his attention watching the room rather than the conversation. Specifically, he watched the way information about Harry was received. Every mention of Harry's name, and his name came up 5 times in the course of the meeting, produced a particular pattern. Concern from Molly, seconded by Arthur. Measured assessment from Lupin that stopped just short of advocacy. From the twins, a tightly contained frustration that expressed itself as studied casualness. From Moody, nothing at all, which was its own kind of signal. And from Dumbledore, a careful, warm, gently authoritative response that conveyed "I have this in hand" without ever quite saying it. The plan, as Kingsley understood it from what was shared, Harry would be moved to Grimmauld Place in 2 weeks. He would resume contact with his friends. He would begin private lessons with Dumbledore in September, concurrent with his return to Hogwarts for his 6th year. The nature of these lessons was not specified. When Lupin asked, gently and precisely, what the curriculum would involve, Dumbledore said, "I believe a deeper understanding of Tom Riddle's history will be our focus," in the tone of someone offering complete information who was in fact offering a fraction of it. Lupin accepted this. Kingsley watched him accept it and saw, in the lines of Lupin's face, the complicated arithmetic of a man who knows he's being given part of the story and has decided that accepting part is better than receiving nothing. The meeting ended just before 11. People filtered out in 1s and 2s. Kingsley stayed to help Molly clear the cups, which he did sometimes and which she accepted without fanfare, because they had that particular kind of easy professional friendship that develops between people who've been in the field together and trust each other's instincts without requiring an explanation. How was he really? Molly said, her back to him, cups stacking themselves under her direction. Kingsley considered the distance between the honest answer and the one he was prepared to give. He was working hard, he said, which was so accurate it functioned as complete truth. Molly turned around and looked at him. She had known him long enough to know this wasn't quite the answer to the question she'd asked. "Kingsley, he's coping better than anyone feared," Kingsley said. "In his own way. Not necessarily the way we choose for him." He looked at her steadily. "But it's working." She studied him for a moment, clearly aware that something was happening at the edges of this conversation that she wasn't being invited into. Then she nodded, once, the nod of a woman who has learned when to push and when to hold back, and who has filed this away for later. 2 weeks, she said, turning back to the cups. 2 weeks, Kingsley agreed, and picked up his coat. He was in the hallway, 3 feet from the front door, when Dumbledore appeared at the top of the stairs. Not from the meeting room. From the upper floor. Which meant he'd gone upstairs during or after the meeting, which wasn't unusual, and positioned himself to intercept Kingsley at the door, which very much was. "A word, Kingsley, if you have a moment," Dumbledore said pleasantly. "Of course," Kingsley said, pleasantly back. They stepped into the small sitting room off the hallway, not the meeting room, not the kitchen, but the less used room that had a faded quality to it, dust and old arguments. Dumbledore closed the door and turned, and he still had the pleasant expression and the half-moon spectacles and the blue eyes, and every one of those features was entirely genuine, which was exactly what made the conversation that Kingsley knew was coming so remarkably complicated. "How was Harry?" Dumbledore said. "As I said in the meeting, Kingsley. Gentle. Final. How was Harry?" The pause between them had a weight to it. Kingsley thought about the sealed parchment in his field kit and about the long discipline of keeping his face from doing anything his mind hadn't authorized. "Awake late," Kingsley said. "In the garden." He mentioned the books, the ones he took from Sirius's room. "He's been reading." He let that sit between them. "He's processing the grief in a way that looks functional from where I'm standing, Albus. He's engaging with things rather than retreating from them. All of it true. None of it complete." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that had the quality of absolute attention, eyes that could make you feel like the most interesting thing in the room while simultaneously not missing a single thing happening anywhere else. He didn't seem distressed. "He seemed focused," Kingsley said. "Which concerned me less than distress would have." A slight shift in Dumbledore's expression, the almost imperceptible micro-movement of someone who has heard something they expected to hear and something they didn't in the same sentence. "I see," Dumbledore said, mildly. "Thank you, Kingsley. I appreciate the candor." "No you don't," Kingsley thought, but he said, "Of course," and left, and stood on the pavement outside Grimmauld Place in the morning air for a full minute before he decided what he was going to do next. Harry arrived 11 days later. Not 2 weeks, 11 days, which Kingsley logged carefully. He came with the standard escort, 2 order members, a portkey from a Muggle phone box 3 streets from Privet Drive, the slightly chaotic landing in the kitchen that portkey arrivals always produced. He had his trunk and his owl and a battered canvas bag over one shoulder that Kingsley recognized as new, meaning he'd acquired it after his last Hogwarts term. The trunk was heavier than it should have been for standard school supplies. Molly caught him before he was fully upright from the landing and held on with the specific urgency of someone who had been counting days, and Harry, and this was the thing Kingsley noted, standing by the kitchen door, let her. He didn't stiffen, didn't produce the awkward endurance that the reports described from previous summers. He stood in Molly Weasley's arms and looked over her shoulder and his face was quiet. Like a room where the furniture has been moved to different places but the light comes through the same windows. Ron was down the stairs in approximately 4 seconds, because he had clearly been listening from the landing, and there was the noise and warmth of reunion, Ron's particular kind of relief expressing itself as jokes and shoulder-shoving, Ginny appearing in the doorway with the careful brightness she used to manage the gap between what she felt and what she showed. And then Hermione came down the stairs. She stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom and looked at Harry across the kitchen, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with words, the specific recognition of 2 people who have been in genuine danger together and carry the same catalogue of things that can't be unsaid or unseen. "You look different," she said. "Good different or bad different?" Harry asked. Her eyes moved over him, quick, thorough, the assessment of someone who reads carefully. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "But different." Ron looked between them. "He looks the same to me." "That's because you're not looking properly," Hermione said, which was accurate and which Ron accepted with the good nature of someone who had long ago decided that accuracy was Hermione's job, and he was broadly fine with that arrangement. Harry met Kingsley's eyes across the kitchen for approximately half a second. Kingsley gave him nothing, which was the appropriate response, and Harry moved on. By that evening, the house had settled into the particular rhythm of too many people in a space that was designed to be oppressive, meals and arguments and the twins' frequent creative experiments, and Ginny reading in the corner with one eye on the room, Molly managing everything with the slightly desperate energy of someone who believes that enough food and warmth can substitute for safety, which it couldn't, but it helped. Kingsley was in the library on the first floor, working through the surveillance logs from the past week, when Hermione appeared in the doorway. She was carrying 3 books and had a quill behind her ear and the specific expression she got when she was about to ask a question she'd already partially answered herself. "Do you mind?" she said, nodding at the room. "Help yourself." She went to the shelves and ran her finger along the spines with the practiced ease of someone navigating a library that she had already thoroughly catalogued. Pulled 2 books without looking at the titles, which meant she'd found them on a previous visit and was returning to them. Sat in the chair across from him. Kingsley kept his eyes on his logs. 20 minutes passed. She broke the silence. "He's been training," she said. "Hasn't he?" "Not a question." Kingsley lowered the logs. "What makes you say that?" "The bag he's carrying has books in it. Old books. And he's holding himself differently, the way you hold yourself when you've been doing physical work consistently. There's also a small burn on his right forearm that's about 2 weeks old, which is consistent with a revulsion jinx rebound, which means he's been practicing complex casting." She looked at him steadily over the top of her book. "And you knew? When he came in, you weren't surprised. You were confirming." Kingsley set the logs down on the table. "You're very observant, Miss Granger." "I'm also very discreet," she said, in the particular tone that meant I am telling you that you can trust me, and I am aware that telling you this doesn't prove it, but I'm hoping you're intelligent enough to evaluate the evidence independently. He was, in fact, intelligent enough to evaluate the evidence independently. He'd been doing so since the moment she walked into the room with the look of someone who had arrived at a conclusion and was seeking corroboration rather than information. "He's going to tell you himself," Kingsley said. "Give him a day." She seemed to weigh this. "What he's doing, is it dangerous?" "The training, I mean. Without supervision." "Most of the genuinely dangerous things in this world," Kingsley said, "happen without supervision. The question isn't whether it's supervised. The question is whether it's intelligent." He picked his logs back up. "It's very intelligent." Hermione absorbed this with the expression of someone recalibrating. "Dumbledore doesn't know." "Dumbledore knows Harry has been reading and staying active. He doesn't know the specifics. And you're not going to tell him." Kingsley looked at her over the top of the logs. "I filed my report." She opened her mouth, read something in his expression, and closed it again. She was quick. He appreciated that. "All right," she said quietly, and went back to her book, and didn't ask anything else. But she didn't leave, either. She sat in the chair across from him for another hour with her books and her quill taking small, precise notes, and Kingsley understood that this was its own kind of statement. She was putting herself in the room, making herself available, signaling that she was already in this conversation even if she hadn't been formally invited. He let her stay. Harry came to find him at midnight. The house was quiet, the specific thick quiet of a building full of sleeping people, the twins' room producing the occasional muffled sound that was either snoring or minor explosions and was probably both. Harry moved through the house the way he'd moved through the garden at Privet Drive, without announcing himself, without wasted motion. He knocked twice on the library door and came in before Kingsley answered, which told him Harry had checked whether the light was on before knocking. He was carrying the canvas bag. He set it on the table without preamble, reached inside, and produced 6 books. He laid them out in a row with the care of someone unpacking something fragile, and Kingsley looked at the spines and felt the particular sensation of a picture that had been slightly out of focus clicking into resolution. SOB's Advanced Combat Transfiguration. 3 volumes of what appeared to be original Aura Field notes, leather-bound and annotated. A thin black book with no title on the spine that had been repaired with a different color leather at the corners, old, very old, the kind of old that made preservation charms necessary. And a 7th volume that Harry placed separately from the others, that had a ministry stamp on its spine that indicated it had once been in a restricted archive. "How did you get that one?" Kingsley asked, nodding at the ministry volume. "It was already in the Grimmauld Place library. Behind the false back I mentioned." Harry sat down. "Someone took it out of the archive about 30 years ago and never returned it. There's a record stamp inside the front cover, checked out under a name that's been removed. But the date's still there. 1974, 1974. Kingsley did the arithmetic without thinking about it. "The First War," he said. "The First War. Someone in this house, probably, someone close to the Blacks, who had access to their library. Someone who was in or connected to the Order in 1974 and needed this." Harry tapped the spine. "It's a detailed breakdown of Voldemort's known magical abilities and methods from the early to mid-First War. Compiled by someone who was watching him closely. There are marginal notes in 3 different hands." Kingsley reached out and Harry pushed the book across the table. He opened it to the middle pages and read in silence for a moment. The text was technical, clinical, precise, the work of someone with genuine analytical skill. The marginal notes were in 2 hands he didn't recognize and one he did. He turned back to the first page. The author's section was blank, deliberately, professionally blank, the kind of blankness that was its own kind of signature. "I think one of the annotators is Moody," Harry said. "The handwriting in blue ink matches his field reports, which I've seen copies of in the Aura training documents Sirius had." Kingsley looked at the blue ink marginalia. "Terse, observational, the kind of notes a man who trusted brevity would make. Confirmed. Right hand dominant under pressure. Watch for left hand secondary." And 2 pages later, "This is wrong," he adapts. "Don't assume pattern stability." That was Moody. That was absolutely Moody. "The other 2 annotators I don't recognize yet," Harry said. "But I will." Kingsley set the book down. "You've been working from these every night." "Every night for 6 weeks. Cross-referencing against the combat transfiguration theory and Sirius's father's Aura notes." Harry leaned forward slightly. "He wasn't just a dark wizard, Kingsley. Voldemort in his first war, he was a system. He had a methodology. He selected targets for specific strategic reasons, he adapted his approach when patterns were identified, he had a layered communication structure with his Death Eaters that meant even those he trusted most didn't know the full picture." He looked at Kingsley with those clear, cool eyes. "He's the same now. The same system, rebuilt. But his Death Eaters are different, some dead, some in Azkaban, some of those back now, some new. The system has weaknesses in the rebuild phase that it didn't have when it was mature." Kingsley stared at him. "That's not intuition," Harry said, and there was something almost defensive in it, not defensive of himself, but of the analysis, like he didn't want Kingsley to give him credit for something he'd actually worked for. "That's 6 weeks of reading and mapping and thinking about it until something like a shape emerged." "I know," Kingsley said. "Harry. I know it's not intuition." He exhaled. "Where did you develop the habit of building analytical frameworks? That's not taught at Hogwarts." Harry looked at the table for a moment. When he looked back up, there was the shadow of something old in his face. "In the cupboard under the stairs," he said, "I had nothing to do but think. I didn't know what I was thinking about. But I'd take something, anything, a spider building a web, a car going by outside, and I'd try to understand the system of it. Why that angle? Why that speed? Why the pattern was shaped the way it was?" A short pause. I was trying to understand why things worked the way they worked. I was 8. I didn't know that was something. The silence in the library was absolute. It's something, Kingsley said. Yeah, Harry said, very quietly. I know that now. He gathered the books back into the bag with the same careful hands. I need to talk to Hermione, he said. She already knows something's going on, she cornered me before dinner. Which, with Hermione, means she's been sitting on it for hours because she wanted to give me a chance to bring it up myself. She came and found me in here this afternoon, Kingsley said. Harry almost smiled. Of course she did. He stood. What did you tell her? That you'd tell her yourself. And that what you're doing is intelligent. Harry nodded slowly. He slung the bag over his shoulder and looked at Kingsley with that direct, assessing quality that had nothing of the deference that most people unconsciously brought to an adult they were talking to. The second report, Harry said. You wrote it. I wrote it. And it's not going to Dumbledore. No. Who's it going to? Kingsley had been thinking about the answer to this question for 11 days. He'd turned it over from every angle, the risk of it, the necessity of it, the shape of what he was actually building here and whether it was reckless or precisely the opposite of reckless. It's going to the right people, he said, at the right time. I'm still working out who that is. But I think, he stopped. Chose the next words carefully. I think the people who need to see it might already be in this building. Harry looked at him steadily. Not Dumbledore. No. Not Moody. Kingsley tilted his head. Why not Moody? Because Moody's loyalty to Dumbledore is absolute. Whatever Moody knows or doesn't know, he'll always refer back to Dumbledore's authority in the end. Harry said it without judgment, a clean assessment, the way you'd say the river runs south or the wall is stone. But Lupin, he stopped himself. Considered. Lupin's more complicated, Harry said. His loyalty is real, but it's conditional in a way he doesn't fully admit to himself. He knows when something isn't right. He just needs someone to give him permission to act on it. Kingsley studied him. You've been thinking about all of them. I've had 11 nights alone with nothing but these books and my own head. The almost smile again. I think about everything. He moved to the door. Stopped with his hand on the frame. We should talk about Neville, he said, and his voice had changed slightly, something careful entering it that hadn't been there before. Not tonight. But soon. There's something about Neville that I can't quite work out from the prophecy alone, and I think it matters more than anyone said out loud. Then he was gone, moving quietly down the dark corridor toward the stairs, and Kingsley sat in the library with 6 books worth of compiled knowledge about Voldemort's strategic methodology and the empty space where Harry had been sitting and thought very clearly and without sentimentality. The second report is going to need more pages. He uncapped his ink. He began to write. Somewhere above him the house creaked and settled and kept its secrets, the way old houses did, the way all things built for the long war eventually did, patient and dark and waiting for the people inside them to figure out what they were actually for. Hermione knocked on the library door at midnight. He heard Harry's voice in the corridor behind her, 2 words, and then she came in with her books under her arm and the expression of someone who has had a conversation that has reordered things considerably. She sat down in the chair across from him, the same chair as the afternoon, and opened one of her books and said nothing at all. 3 minutes later, Harry came in and sat on the edge of the table and said, Right. Let's start from the beginning. And Kingsley thought, there it is. The thing he'd been trying to identify since the garden at Privet Drive, the specific quality of what Harry had that went beyond the Wandless magic and the analytical frameworks and the books full of someone else's hard-won knowledge. It was the instinct to build, to find the right people and begin, without waiting for permission, without ceremony, with the practical clarity of someone who understood that wars were not won by individuals but by teams, and that teams were built by the person who was willing to be the first one to say sit down, let's start from the beginning. Kingsley set down his quill and listened. Outside, London went about its vast and indifferent business. Inside Grimmauld Place, in a library full of someone else's books, 3 people began to figure out how to win a war that everyone else was still arguing about whether to fight. Chapter 3, The Shape of a War. The first thing Harry put on the table, literally, physically put on the table, was a map. Not a magical map, not a Marauder-style piece of parchment with moving figures and clever enchantments. A hand-drawn map, done on 3 sheets of Muggle paper taped together, pencil and ink, the kind of thing you made when you were thinking too fast for magic and needed your hands to keep up. It covered what Harry understood of Voldemort's known and probable locations, his Death Eater network's movements as inferred from newspaper reports and order meeting fragments Harry had overheard or been told in careful, partial doses over 2 years, and a series of red circles that Hermione leaned over and identified immediately. "These are the Ministry attack points from last year," she said. "And the year before," Harry said. Cross-referenced. He put his finger on a cluster of 3 circles near the center of the map. "There's a pattern. Not in the targets themselves, the targets look random if you're looking at them individually. But if you map the timing and the resource deployment, he's testing response times," Kingsley said. He'd been looking at the map for about 30 seconds and had already arrived at the same conclusion. Each incident, he's measuring how long it takes the Ministry and the Order to respond, and from which direction, and with what resources. Which means, Harry said, he already knows the Order's response patterns. He's known them for at least 2 years. Hermione sat back. That means someone's been feeding him information, or the pattern is observable enough that he doesn't need a source. He just needs to be smarter than the people he's watching. Harry looked at the map. Both are probably true. But even without a source, the pattern exists. And if we know he knows it, we can use that. This was, Kingsley thought, the 3rd time in a week Harry had said something that should have taken a trained Auror significantly longer to arrive at. He'd stopped being surprised. He'd started being quietly, precisely worried, not about Harry's conclusions but about the fact that this analysis had been sitting in a 16-year-old's head in a garden in Surrey while the Order of the Phoenix filed reports to each other about Mundungus's vague surveillance. "What's the play?" Hermione asked. "Not yet." Harry sat down and pulled the map back. "We need more before we start moving pieces. There are things I don't know yet that I need to know before any of this is useful." He looked at Kingsley. "The Horcruxes." The word landed in the room and stayed there. Kingsley kept his expression steady. "What do you know?" "Enough to know what they are and not enough to know where they are." Harry laced his fingers together on the table, a gesture that was almost scholarly. "Dumbledore has been investigating this separately. I know that from context, from the things he's been careful not to say in my presence. He's mentioned Tom Riddle's diary from 2nd year, and I know the diary was a Horcrux because I know what it did. It contained a piece of Riddle's soul and it was destroyed when I stabbed it with the basilisk fang." He paused. "That wasn't an accident. Dumbledore knew what the diary was before I went down into the chamber. He didn't tell me. He didn't want to put the information in front of a 12-year-old during a crisis," Kingsley said, "because it was a defensible position even if he found it frustrating." "Maybe. But I'm not 12 now." Harry's voice was flat. Not angry, flat, which was worse in some ways. "And he still hasn't told me directly. So I've been working it out myself." He reached into the canvas bag and produced a sheet of parchment covered in notes. "There are multiple Horcruxes. Voldemort didn't stop at one. The magic doesn't make sense if you stop at one, because the whole point of the ritual is about dividing the soul to prevent full death, and someone as obsessed with immortality as he was wouldn't set one anchor when he could set several. I think the number is significant to him. Something symbolic." Hermione was very still in the way she got when she was rapidly processing. 7, she said. "If he's following Horcrux theory from the standard dark magic literature, which I've read, I found it in Secrets of the Darkest Art in the restricted section 2nd year, the number that has the most esoteric significance for soul division is 7. She looked at Harry. "Did you find the same?" Yes. And the diary was 1, so 6 remaining when it was destroyed, 5 now if Dumbledore's destroyed another, which I suspect he has because of the state of his hand. The state of his hand. Kingsley had noticed it too, the blackened, withered quality of Dumbledore's right hand that had appeared over the summer and that Dumbledore had not explained and that no one in the Order had asked about directly, because asking Dumbledore directly about something he hadn't offered was simply not something Order members did. What happened to his hand, Kingsley said, slowly, is related to a Horcrux. Has to be, Harry said. The damage is consistent with a very powerful dark object's defense mechanism. He found one and destroyed it, and it cost him. He looked at Kingsley with careful precision. Which means he's already ahead of where he's letting on. He has a list. He knows what they are, or at least some of them. He's moving on them alone, without telling anyone else in the Order. Because if the Death Eaters knew the Order was hunting Horcruxes, Hermione started. They'd protect them. Yes. Harry pulled the parchment back. But the problem with Dumbledore doing this alone isn't just the risk of him dying with the information, although that's a genuine problem. The problem is that he's moving on a timeline that depends on Voldemort not figuring out what he's doing, and Voldemort is considerably smarter than Dumbledore gives him credit for in this specific area. He stopped. Voldemort respects Dumbledore's power. He doesn't respect Dumbledore's intelligence. Which means he's not trying to outthink Dumbledore, he's trying to outpower him, and he thinks those are the same thing. Dumbledore is exploiting that. But exploiting an enemy's blind spot only works until the enemy's other capacities compensate for it. You think Voldemort will figure out the Horcrux hunt, Kingsley said. I think he might already suspect it. And when he moves to protect them, Harry spread his hands over the map. The window closes. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city sat in its late-night hush. Somewhere in the house above them a floorboard creaked, probably Ron, who had the sleep patterns of someone whose body had never quite synced with the idea of lying still. Right, Hermione said, and there was something decided in her voice, the particular tone that meant she'd finished the calculation and arrived somewhere. So what do we actually do with all of this? We build a parallel track, Harry said. Not against Dumbledore, alongside him. We do our own work on the Horcrux question, share information with him strategically without giving away that we're doing independent work, and we keep Dumbledore moving at his own pace while we move faster. That is, Hermione said carefully, an extremely ambitious plan for 3 people in a library. 2 weeks ago it was 1 person in a garden. She looked at him and then at Kingsley and then back at Harry with an expression that moved through several stages, skepticism, calculation, and something that wasn't quite admiration but was adjacent to it. You're going to need more than 3 people, she said. I know, Harry said. That's why we're talking about Neville. Kingsley had written 3 lines in the second report about Neville Longbottom. 3 lines that he'd come back to every day since writing them, turning them over, reading them in different lights and different states of tiredness and concentration to see if they still said what he thought they said. They did. He'd written them after reading the full text of the prophecy, the version he had access to as a senior Order member, which Dumbledore had shared with the inner circle after the ministry. Born as the 7th month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. The prophecy didn't name Harry. That was what the 3 lines were about. It described a child born at the end of July to parents who had thrice defied Voldemort. It described Voldemort marking his equal, and Voldemort had marked Harry, the killing curse leaving its scar, making that choice seem unambiguous. But the prophecy had been spoken before the choice was made. It described 2 boys. It had always described 2 boys. Harry had been born July 31st, Neville Longbottom had been born July 30th, Voldemort had chosen Harry because Harry was a half-blood like him, and in his arrogance had dismissed the pure-blood boy as less threatening. But the prophecy hadn't made that choice. The prophecy had described both of them with equal precision, and Voldemort's choice to mark Harry didn't eliminate the other possibility, it simply hadn't been tested. Kingsley had written, the prophecy describes 2 candidates. Voldemort chose 1. His choice marked 1. But mark is not equal to fulfill. The question of whether the prophecy's power function requires the specific chosen individual or the class of eligible individuals is not one I've seen addressed anywhere in the Order's documentation. It should be. Then, NL's parents. What was done to them? Why specifically them, and why at that time, when the war was already effectively over? This isn't established with certainty as connected to the prophecy, but the timeline alignment is significant enough to warrant investigation that has not, to my knowledge, occurred. Then, the third line, which was the one that kept him awake, if the prophecy's power can be fulfilled by either candidate, Voldemort's current focus on HP as the specific threat is itself a strategic vulnerability. It is also a potential source of danger for NL that the Order has not adequately planned for. He hadn't known what to do with any of this when he'd written it. He knew now, or he knew the beginning of what to do with it, which was to put it in front of the people in this library and see what happened. He put the 3 lines in front of Harry and Hermione the next morning. Not the full second report, he wasn't ready for that yet, and there were things in it that needed to stay private until the moment was right. But the 3 lines about Neville, he transcribed onto a fresh piece of parchment and laid on the table between their teacups, and watched them read it. Hermione read it twice. Her face went through a complicated sequence that ended at a kind of pale, precise focus. Harry read it once and didn't move for a long time. "I know," Harry said finally. "I've known since Dumbledore told me that it could have been him." "How long have you been sitting with that?" Hermione asked, quietly. "Since June." He looked at the parchment. He stopped. Started again. "He's my friend. He was there in the ministry. He fought, he got hurt, he could have died because I was wrong about the vision. And none of that had anything to do with a prophecy. He was there because he chose to be there." His jaw tightened briefly. "But the prophecy is still out there. Voldemort lost the Department of Mysteries and the recording was destroyed, but he knows what it says, he heard it from someone. Bode, or another ministry connection. He knows the content. He might revisit the question," Kingsley said. "If he becomes convinced that his read of the prophecy was narrower than the actual conditions, he'll go after Neville," Hermione said, very quietly. "Or he'll go after him as leverage. Or as a test." Harry pushed back from the table and stood, and the movement had the quality of contained energy rather than agitation, the movement of someone who needs to be on their feet to think. "Neville's parents. Frank and Alice." He looked at Kingsley. "The timing. Your second line, you said the timing was significant." "November 1981, Kingsley said. "Voldemort fell on Halloween. The attack on the Longbottoms was in November, after Bellatrix Lestrange, Bartemius Crouch Jr., and 2 others. The official account is that they were trying to extract information about Voldemort's whereabouts or possible return. That's always been the explanation." He looked at the parchment. "But that explanation makes limited sense operationally. Voldemort had just fallen. No one in the Death Eater network was conducting coordinated intelligence operations in that window, they were scattering, going to ground, trying to save themselves. A coordinated attack on an Auror family 2 weeks after the Dark Lord's defeat requires a level of organizational discipline that the Death Eater network didn't have in that moment." Harry was very still. "Unless someone ordered it before Voldemort fell." The room was quiet. "A contingency," Hermione said. "He ordered it as a contingency, in case something happened to him." "As a cleanup operation," Kingsley said. "If the prophecy describes 2 candidates and Voldemort had chosen Harry as his primary, the Longbottoms were still a loose end in the prophecy's terms. Frank and Alice Longbottom were among the most talented Aurors of their generation. If there was any chance Neville represented an alternative fulfillment of the prophecy, he wanted them unable to train him," Harry said. "He didn't kill Neville because killing Neville might have triggered the same protective magic that protected me. The prophecy itself might have worked against him. So instead, he stopped. His voice had gone very flat. He neutralized his parents. Left Neville alive. An orphan, effectively. Without the people best equipped to help him become whatever the prophecy might make him. The three of them sat with this for a moment that was not comfortable and was not supposed to be. Neville needs to know, Hermione said. Not everything, Harry said immediately. Not yet. Not like this, in a library, from a report. He looked at Kingsley. But he needs to be in this conversation. He deserves to be in this conversation. And he needs better training than he's been getting. He paused. He's more capable than anyone's given him credit for. He was incredible in the Department of Mysteries. Incredible. He kept going when most people would have stopped. He kept going because he was fighting for his parents, Kingsley said. He just didn't know he was also fighting for himself. Same as me, Harry said, without any drama in it. Just truth. He picked up the transcribed 3 lines and folded the parchment precisely. Write the rest of that section out properly, he said to Kingsley. The full analysis. I want to have it when we talk to him. And when will that be? Harry looked at the door. I'll go find him now. Neville Longbottom was in the garden. Not Grimmauld Place's garden, which was small and north-facing and had the slightly hostile quality of a space that had never been tended with care. But he was outside, on the narrow step at the back door, with his hands wrapped around a mug of something and a worn herbology text open across his knees, and he had the look he often had when he was somewhere between reading and thinking, the absent, focused expression of a person whose interior world was considerably more active than his surface suggested. He was also, Harry noticed, systematically working through a set of spell modifications in his head. His lips moved slightly, very slightly, the barely perceptible movement of someone who has learned to rehearse mentally rather than aloud because something in their history taught them that saying it out loud invites correction. Harry sat down on the step beside him without announcing it. Neville looked up. All right? Yeah. You? Fine. Couldn't sleep. He looked back at his book, turned a page, turned it back. Gran's letter this morning. She wants me to spend the last week of August at home before term. Are you going? Probably. She'll, you know how she gets. A pause. She worries. She doesn't say so, but she does. Harry was quiet for a moment. The morning was grey and cool, London making its early sounds above the house. A pigeon on the garden wall regarded them with the specific blank indifference of pigeons everywhere. Neville, Harry said. I need to tell you some things. And I need you to not immediately try to find a reason why it's not a big deal, because it is a big deal, and you deserve to know it. Neville put the book down slowly. He looked at Harry with an expression that was careful and braced, but not afraid. This was the thing about Neville, the thing people who dismissed him consistently missed. He could be afraid of a class, afraid of making a mistake, afraid of a teacher's contempt, but when something was genuinely serious, when the stakes were actually real, Neville Longbottom did not flinch. Harry had watched him take a broken nose at the ministry and keep walking. All right, Neville said. He set his mug down. Harry told him about the prophecy. Not the official version, the full shape of it, with Kingsley's analysis attached, and the reasoning about his parents, and what it might mean going forward. He talked for about 15 minutes, straight through, without softening anything. Neville listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react visibly in the way Harry had half expected, no anger, no collapse, none of the dramatic reconfigurations Harry had been steeling himself for. He sat on the step with his hands loose on his knees and his face doing complicated, quiet things, and he listened to the entire thing. When Harry finished, Neville was quiet for a long moment. My parents, he said. The words had a quality to them, careful, like he was testing their weight. You think the attack was deliberate? Not just Bellatrix being Bellatrix. I think it was ordered. Contingency protocol. Before or after Halloween? Probably before. As an order standing if Voldemort was killed or incapacitated. Neville nodded slowly. His jaw worked once. I've thought about why them, sometimes, he said. Everyone always said Bellatrix was, that she was just like that she needed a reason about as much as a storm needs a reason. But I always thought, he stopped. They were Aurors. Good ones. You don't torture two very good Aurors to the point of, for information you're not expecting to get. You don't do that for information. You do it for something else. Yeah, Harry said. You do. Another long silence. The pigeon left the wall. So what does it mean? Neville asked. For now. Practically. And this was what Harry meant, what he'd said to Kingsley about Neville, not that the grief wasn't there but that it didn't stop him, didn't collapse him inward. He received it and moved to the next question, the practical question, the what do we do question, which was exactly the kind of mind you needed when the information was this heavy. It means you might be a target in a way you haven't planned for, Harry said. It also means, he paused. Chose the next words with care. You have capability that nobody's been taking seriously. Including you, sometimes. Neville looked at him sideways. Harry, the DA. You were one of the best in the DA. Not one of the better students, one of the best. Dumbledore's army could produce 3 or 4 people who could fight a Death Eater and hold their own, and you were one of them. And no one's building on that. He held Neville's gaze. I want to. I need to, and I want to, and you deserve someone who's actually looking at what you can do instead of where you started. Neville was quiet. Something moved in his face that was difficult to name, not emotion exactly but the adjustment of a long-standing internal picture, a recalibration of something that had been set at the wrong coordinates for years. Kingsley, he said. He's involved. He is. And Hermione. Yes. Neville picked his mug back up. Looked at it. Set it back down. What are we actually building here, he asked. What's the goal? To be ready, Harry said. Really ready. Not Hogwarts ready, not Order adjacent ready. Ready for what this war actually is. He looked at the grey sky. Dumbledore has a plan. I think it's a good plan as far as it goes. But it depends on me surviving long enough to act on it, and it depends on nobody else being taken out before we get there. And it only works if the Horcruxes are destroyed, which, Dumbledore's moving on that, but slowly, and alone, which is going to become a problem. He looked back at Neville. I'm not going to wait for permission to be useful. I'm not going to sit at Hogwarts for another year playing student and hoping Voldemort doesn't move until the school year's conveniently over. Neville almost smiled. No, he said. I didn't think you were. Are you in? Neville considered this for approximately 3 seconds, which Harry thought showed admirable decisiveness given what he'd just been told. Yes, Neville said. Obviously. They met in the library every night for the next week. The house settled into its routines around them, meals and order business and the Weasley family's constant warm background noise, and their meetings existed inside that routine without disrupting it, invisible in the way that things happening quietly inside a busy household tended to be invisible. Molly knew something was happening in the library after midnight, she was far too perceptive not to. She said nothing, which Harry understood as a specific kind of permission. Ron was the complication. It wasn't that Ron was unintelligent, Harry had never thought Ron was unintelligent, had in fact relied on Ron's instincts and his chess player's strategic mind for 6 years. But Ron's relationship with information that went against the established order of things was complicated in a way that was deeply embedded in who he was. He trusted Dumbledore with the particular unexamined certainty of someone who had grown up in a household that trusted Dumbledore, and challenging that trust felt to him less like strategic thinking and more like personal betrayal. Hermione raised it on the 4th night. We should tell him, she said. Not yet, Harry said. He'll be angry when he finds out we didn't. He'll be angrier if we tell him now and he goes to his mum. Harry looked at her steadily. I know Ron. I trust Ron. I love Ron. But this stays small until we know what we're doing with it. Hermione was quiet for a moment. Then, that's fair. I don't like it. But it's fair. What developed over those 7 nights was something that had a shape to it, a structure that none of them had named yet but that they all recognized, the way you recognize a building before you've learned its name. Kingsley brought the intelligence, order information, aura records, his own analytical read of Death Eater movements. Hermione built the research framework, cross-referencing Harry's books with restricted section texts she'd been extracting from Hogwarts Library on loan for 3 years under Madame Pance's academic trust policy. Neville brought the thing none of them had quite expected, which was memory. He had a memory like a legal archive. Dates, names, locations, connections, the kind of recall that had spent years being invisible because it mostly expressed itself through herbology and was therefore dismissed as narrow. But memory doesn't respect subject lines, and Neville's recall of the First War, of his grandmother's stories, of aura histories he'd absorbed through years of growing up in a household shaped by their absence, it was operational intelligence. Things he knew without knowing he knew them until Harry or Hermione or Kingsley asked the right question and he'd say, simply, my gran mentioned something about that, and produce a piece of information that shifted the map. Harry trained. He trained every morning, before the house woke up, in the back garden that was too small and north-facing and slightly hostile. He trained wandlessly, he trained against shield variations Hermione constructed from the theory books, he trained the physical evasion sequences that Kingsley ran him through with the brisk efficiency of someone who had developed his own muscle memory and knew the fastest route to someone else's. Neville trained with him. Not from the beginning. The first morning Neville appeared at the back door at 6:30 in his jacket with the air of someone who had made a decision at 2 in the morning and intended to see it through. Harry had looked at him for a moment and then simply said good, start here, and shown him the footwork sequence. Within 3 days it was clear that Neville had been significantly undertrained, not undertaught. The knowledge was there. The instinct was there. What he'd lacked was someone who looked at him and saw capacity rather than limitation. And being looked at that way, being trained by someone who assumed he would get it rather than expecting him not to, changed the speed at which he developed dramatically. On the 7th night, Harry spread the map on the table and added new elements, red marks for known Horcrux candidates, blue for destroyed, a question mark cluster in the middle where the information ran out. The locket, Harry said. Slytherin's locket. Creature mentioned it, at Grimmauld Place. He talked about a locket that couldn't be destroyed. It's gone from the house now, but it was here. That's a Horcrux. He looked at the map. The cup. Hufflepuff's cup is most likely, Voldemort collected founder artifacts, it fits the pattern of him wanting trophies, wanting things that have power beyond the object itself. Helga Hufflepuff's cup is somewhere connected to the Lestrange family, given the way Bellatrix, he stopped. The way she talks about Voldemort's things. Like she's the one responsible for them. Gringotts, Kingsley said. The Lestrange vault. Yeah. Harry looked at the blue marks. The diary. Destroyed. Whatever Dumbledore destroyed, cost him his hand. 5 remaining at minimum. Possibly 6. He stood back. This is the real war. Not the battles, not the Death Eater network, not the Ministry. This. If these still exist when we face him, killing him does nothing. Hermione had been looking at the map with the expression that meant she was 4 steps ahead and choosing which step to articulate first. The Horcrux hunt and the war aren't separable, she said. Voldemort will protect them. Hunting them means engagement with his inner circle. Which means the fight comes to us whether we go looking for it or not, Harry said. So we'd better be ready for it when it does. He looked around at the 3 of them, Kingsley with his steady aura calm, Hermione with her pencil poised over her notes, Neville sitting forward with his elbows on the table and his jaw set in the particular way that meant he was committed to something, and felt something he hadn't felt since before the Ministry. Not confidence, exactly. Something quieter and harder than confidence. The thing you feel when you have done the work and looked at the situation honestly and built a foundation you actually trust. We're going to need one more person inside the Order, Harry said. Someone who can give us information from inside Dumbledore's planning without realizing they're doing it. Lupin, Kingsley said. Lupin, Harry agreed. He just needs a reason to look at things differently. A question asked the right way, at the right time. And if he takes it straight to Dumbledore? Neville asked. He might, Harry said. But I think, he paused. I think Lupin's been waiting for a long time for someone to ask him the right questions. He's loyal to Dumbledore. He's not loyal to Dumbledore's information management. Those are different things, and I think somewhere in there, Lupin knows it. Outside the library window, London was going dark and deep into its night hours. The house above them had settled into sleep. The map lay on the table with its red circles and blue marks and question marks, the shape of a war that had been ongoing for 16 years rendered in pencil and ink on 3 sheets of Muggle paper taped together. Harry looked at it for a long moment. One more thing, he said. Before we stop for tonight. He reached into the canvas bag and produced the thin black book with the repaired corners, the oldest one, the one with no title on the spine. I've been working through this for 6 weeks, he said. And I think, he set it on the table with the careful deliberateness that meant it was significant. I think this is a personal journal. From someone who knew Voldemort. Before he became Voldemort. Someone who watched him closely and wrote down everything they saw. Hermione reached for it. Opened it to the middle. Read for a moment. This is brilliant, she said quietly. This is analytically brilliant. Whoever wrote this understood him better than anyone I've read. She looked up. What are the initials again? S.O.B., Harry said. I've been trying to work it out for 6 weeks. The Combat Transfiguration textbook has the same initials. I think they're the same person. An Auror, Kingsley said, slowly. Someone in this house, 30 years ago. He reached out and touched the spine. S.O.B. He looked up at Harry. Do you know who Arcturus Black's most trusted associate was? In the Order, in the First War. Harry shook his head. Celine Orla Burke, Kingsley said. Half-blood. First-rate Auror. Left the Order in 1978 under circumstances that were never fully explained, and died in 1979 under circumstances that were even less explained. He looked at the book. Her married name was Black. The room was very quiet. She was Sirius's aunt, Harry said. By marriage. Not blood. Kingsley looked at him. Which is probably why you found the books in his room rather than anywhere else in this house. She gave them to him. Or he took them to remember her. A pause. She spent the last year of the First War watching Voldemort more closely than anyone else in the Order. And then she died. Harry picked up the journal. Held it. Something in his face had shifted slightly, not grief, but the specific quality of finding a thread that leads somewhere important. Then we're going to read every word she wrote, he said. Because if she was that close and figured out that much, he looked at the map, at the question mark cluster, at the thing they were building together in this library. She might have found something the rest of them missed. He set the journal in the center of the table. Around it, the map spread its red circles and blue marks and the vast, complex territory of a war that was coming whether they were ready or not. They were going to be ready. Chapter 4, Teeth. The attack on Diagon Alley happened on a Tuesday. Harry knew it was a Tuesday because he'd been in the middle of a training sequence with Neville, the left-hand pivot Kingsley had drilled into them both over the past week, and he'd been thinking about the fact that Tuesdays at Grimmauld Place had a specific rhythm to them, Order correspondence arriving in the morning, Molly's shopping run in the afternoon, the slight loosening of the house's tension that came with Arthur's early return from the ministry. He'd been thinking about this and correcting Neville's weight distribution simultaneously, and then Kingsley came through the back door at a speed that immediately stopped all other thinking. Diagon Alley, Kingsley said. He was already pulling his outer robe on. Death Eaters. 3 confirmed sightings, Flourish and Blots area, roughly 5 minutes ago. Tonks just Patronus messaged me from the scene. Harry dropped the training stance. How many? Unknown. Tonks said at least 4, possibly more. Kingsley looked at him with the specific expression that contained a question he wasn't going to ask out loud. We're coming, Harry said. Harry, Kingsley. He met the older man's eyes. Not asking. Informing. We're coming. A beat. Kingsley read something in Harry's face and nodded once. Hermione? She's in the library. Go, I'll get her. He was already moving. He found Hermione on the library stairs, which meant she'd heard Kingsley's arrival and was 3/4 of the way to the same decision Harry had made. She had her wand in her hand and her shoes on and the expression of someone who had been waiting for something like this and was not going to pretend otherwise. Diagon Alley, Harry said. I heard. She fell into step beside him. Neville was in the hallway pulling his jacket on. No conversation required. Ron appeared at the top of the stairs. He took in the 3 of them, wands, coats, the particular quality of directed movement that was unmistakable, and said, What's happening, in a voice that was already shifting registers from sleepy to alert. Harry looked at him. Death Eaters in Diagon Alley. We're going. Ron was down the stairs in 4 seconds. Give me 2 seconds to get my wand. You have 2 seconds, Harry said. Molly's voice came from the kitchen. What's all that? She appeared in the hallway doorway and read the room, and her face did the thing it always did in moments like this, the collision between fierce maternal instinct and the knowledge that the people in front of her were not children in any meaningful sense that applied to this situation. Harry James Potter, Kingsley's with us, Harry said. Tonks is already on scene. We're backup, not lead. He looked at her directly. I won't do anything stupid. That's not, Molly. His voice was gentle and completely immovable. We're going. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the 4 of them, and something complicated crossed her face, the same arithmetic she'd been doing since the beginning, the math of love against necessity, and necessity kept winning and she kept having to let it. All of you come back, she said. Which was the only thing she had left to say, and she knew it, and she said it anyway because saying it was the thing she could still do. They were out the door before she'd finished. Diagon Alley in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon should have been its quiet weekday self, a handful of customers at Gringotts, some foot traffic between Ollivanders and the apothecary, the background business of a wizarding commercial street going about its summer routine. What Harry walked into was a street in the early stages of panic. Not chaos yet, the specific moment before chaos, when people have understood that something is wrong but haven't yet made the decision to run. Shop doors standing open. A smashed window at the apothecary, glass across the cobblestones, an overturned display from a shop whose name Harry didn't catch. 3 people pressed against the wall of Gringotts with their wands drawn and their faces white. And further up, near Flourish and Blots, a sound that Harry's nervous system identified before his brain did, the sharp crack of spell impact, the particular quality of magical combat, the way the air tasted different when curses were flying. Kingsley was already moving ahead of them, aura training taking over, his stride shifting into the controlled speed advance that covered ground fast without sacrificing readiness. Tonks was visible at the corner of Flourish and Blots, her hair bright pink and her face set, exchanging fire with someone Harry couldn't yet see. Fan out, Harry said quietly. Don't bunch up. Hermione left, Neville right, Ron stay back 20 feet and watch the rear. Anyone comes from the leaky cauldron end, call it. No one asked questions. They moved. Harry went straight. He came around the corner of Flourish and Blots and took in the situation in approximately 1 second of assessment. For Death Eaters, masked, robed, moving with the coordinated aggression of people who had done this before. One had Tonks pinned behind a bookshop awning, firing consistent pressure that kept her from engaging the others. 2 more were systematically destroying the front of Madame Malkin's robed shop, not robbery, Harry registered, not looting. Destruction. Targeted, deliberate, the methodical destruction of a wizarding business as a statement. The 4th was standing further back, near the entrance to Nocturne Alley, watching, not casting. Coordinator. Harry's eyes went to the 4th one for half a second and then he moved. He hit the nearest Death Eater, the one keeping Tonks pinned, with a reductor curse that he'd been practicing for 6 weeks at the precise angle Sirius's father's notes recommended against left-handed casters. The man was large, casting with his left hand, and Harry's curse caught the edge of his shield at the angle that translated force sideways rather than blocking. The shield fractured. The Death Eater stumbled. Tonks was moving before he'd fully stumbled. She came out from behind the awning with a stunner that was fast and accurate and caught the man in the chest while his shield was still compromised. 1 down. Harry didn't stop moving. He was already to the right, out of the position he'd cast from, because staying put after a cast was how you got hit, and Kingsley's drilling on this specific point had been thorough enough that the movement was automatic now. The 2 Death Eaters destroying Madame Malkin spun toward him and Harry had the brief, useful experience of being exactly the kind of threat that people hadn't prepared for. They'd expected orders. They'd expected the order's standard response. What they got was a 16-year-old who moved like he'd been in 3 genuine combat situations before this one and who cast with a precision that did not match the size of the person holding the wand. The first one fired a blasting curse and Harry sidestepped it, not a diving, dramatic sidestep but the quarter-step pivot Kingsley had drilled, economical and efficient, the curse going past his left shoulder and detonating against Gringotts steps with a sound like a door slamming. He returned the blasting curse with a disarming spell, which was not the instinct but was the right choice, because a disarmed Death Eater was more useful than an unconscious one and the man had just revealed his casting rhythm. The wand came out of the Death Eater's hand and Harry caught it one-handed in the same motion, barely looking, and kept his eyes on the second one. The second Death Eater was smarter. He hadn't fired yet. He was circling, which meant he was trying to find an angle where Harry's attention on the first one created an opening. This was textbook dueling and Harry had read the textbook, written by S.O.B. and annotated by Alastair Moody, and knew what came next. He let the circle happen. Let the Death Eater find the angle he was looking for. Let him commit to the cast. Then Harry simply wasn't where he was supposed to be. The Cruciatus curse, and Harry's stomach registered what it was even as his body was moving, went through empty air. Harry was 2 meters left, already casting, and he hit the man with a body bind so hard he left a scorch mark on the cobblestones when he landed. Kingsley had the 4th one, the coordinator, engaged near the Nocturne Alley entrance, and it was a different quality of fight entirely. The coordinator was good. Very good. The kind of good that meant senior Death Eater, inner circle, someone who had been doing this for 20 years. Kingsley was better, but Kingsley was also alone with him and managing the fight rather than winning it, keeping distance and firing precise, probing curses that were looking for a pattern. Harry moved toward them. He was 15 feet away when the coordinator broke off the engagement, just abandoned it, mid-exchange, in a way that was so contrary to dueling instinct that it took Kingsley a full second to recalibrate. The coordinator reached inside his robe and produced something and threw it, and Harry's mind was already saying portkey even as he was shouting, "Don't let him," but Kingsley was already there. A severing charm, precise and almost casual, cut the portkey cord mid-arc, and the small object clattered to the cobblestones and didn't activate. The coordinator had half a second of stillness where the escape had been and wasn't. Kingsley walked toward him and the quality of his presence in that moment was something Harry filed away carefully, the specific gravity of someone who has done this for a long time and does not hurry because he does not need to. "Drop it," Kingsley said. The coordinator dropped it. Hermione had the nearest alleyway closed off with a shielding charm that Harry had never seen her use in combat before but which was architecturally sophisticated, layered, double-anchored, the kind of shield that bounced rather than absorbed. She'd been thinking about combat applications of her research and it showed. Neville had 2 stunned muggles, bystanders who'd been inside Flourish and Blots when it started, behind a conjured barrier, keeping them clear of the fight with a steadiness that Harry registered and felt a specific, quiet pride about. Ron had dealt with a fifth Death Eater that Harry hadn't seen, someone who'd come from the leaky cauldron end as Harry had suspected was possible, and who was now face down on the cobblestones with Ron standing over him looking slightly wild-eyed but functional. Harry looked at Ron. Ron looked at Harry. "Was going to mention I saw movement at the far end," Ron said. "Didn't have time." "You handled it." "Well. Yeah." Ron looked at the person on the cobblestones. "I handled it." The aftermath of a magical combat in Diagon Alley took approximately 40 minutes to begin sorting out, and it was not a quiet or straightforward 40 minutes. Magical law enforcement arrived 7 minutes after the engagement ended, which told Harry something about Ministry response times that Kingsley had been trying to explain in the abstract and that was much clearer in experience. 7 minutes. Against a coordinated team with a coordinator who'd clearly had a portkey escape planned, 7 minutes was a theoretical exercise in being too late. The Ministry Aurors who arrived were competent and professionally uneasy, competent because they were, uneasy because the scene they arrived at had already been contained by people they hadn't deployed, and this created a bureaucratic friction that expressed itself as clipped questions and deliberate control of the sequencing of events. Kingsley handled them. He had the particular skill of managing institutional machinery without appearing to manage it, presenting facts in the order that most clearly established legitimate authority, giving credit for the situation being contained to Tonks's Patronus alert and the rapid order response, neither lying nor volunteering anything that would direct attention toward Harry and the others in a way that would generate the kind of official paperwork that Dumbledore would see. Harry stood to the side and watched this and understood it, and was quietly grateful for it, and knew he owed Kingsley a clarity of acknowledgement about that which would have to wait for a private moment. The detained Death Eaters were handled. The coordinator, whose mask had come off in the final moments of the engagement, turned out to be Rodolphius Lestrange, which created its own ripple of significance that Harry let sit in the back of his mind for later examination. 2 others were identified, the fourth, the one Harry had disarmed, had managed an apparition between the moment of disarming and the Ministry arrival, which was a failure Harry was already mentally reviewing. Tonks found Harry near Gringotts Steps while the Ministry was occupied with the others. She looked him over with her aura assessment eyes, the look she sometimes tried to soften with jokes and right now wasn't bothering to. "You all right?" "Fine." "You?" "Grand. My ribs have opinions about the evening but I've had worse." She looked at him more carefully. "Harry. The reductor you opened with. That was, where did you learn that angle of approach?" "Books," Harry said. "What books?" "Old ones." He met her eyes. "I'm fine, Tonks." "Really?" She studied him. She was perceptive in a way that her cheerful exterior sometimes obscured, and Harry had always known this and respected it. "You've been training," she said. "Yes." "Without telling anyone?" "Without making an announcement," he said carefully. "Kingsley knows." This landed. She looked toward Kingsley, who was managing the Ministry Aurors with serene professionalism, and something moved in her face, the recalibration of someone who has received information that slightly reorders a picture they thought they had. "All right," she said. "All right." A pause. "That shielding charm Hermione used, the layered one. I want to know how to build that." "Ask her," Harry said. "She'll teach you." Hermione, from 3 feet away, appeared to have heard this. "I will," she said, without looking up from where she was performing a diagnostic spell on the damaged shopfront. They were back at Grimmauld Place by 5 o'clock. Molly had produced food with the particular urgency of someone who expresses relief through feeding people, and Arthur was already home from the Ministry. Harry guessed that news of the Diagon Alley incident had moved through the building fast, and he sat at the kitchen table with the specific expression of a man who had been very worried and was extremely glad to be wrong about the worst of it. Ron ate 3 sandwiches in the first 6 minutes and talked through them about the Death Eater he'd dealt with, and the talking through food was so specifically Ron that Harry found himself almost smiling. But underneath the meal and the relief and Molly's brisk management of everyone's minor injuries, Neville had a burn on his left wrist from a deflected stinging hex, Harry had a cut on his jaw from flying glass. Underneath all of that, something was moving in Harry's head that the fight had brought to the surface and that wouldn't sit still. The attack hadn't been random. He'd known it in the moment, the systematic destruction of Madame Malkins, the coordinator standing back and watching, the portkey prepared in advance. This wasn't opportunistic violence. This was a statement. And statements were communications, which meant the question was always, who's the audience? Not the people of Diagon Alley. Not the Muggle media. The wizarding community. Yes, we can reach you anywhere, we can do this whenever we choose, but specifically the Order and the Ministry. A demonstration of reach. A demonstration of coordinated capacity. And there was the leak. He came back to it as Molly was cleaning the cut on his jaw with a damp cloth and something that stung significantly more than it should have. The Order's response patterns had been mapped, as Harry had established 3 weeks ago from the intelligence on the map. Someone had been feeding information. The Death Eaters had come to Diagon Alley at a time when the Order's standing patrol was at minimum, Tuesday afternoon, between Tonks's rotation end and the next Aura deployment, which was either a coincidence or it was foreknowledge of the patrol schedule. Patrol schedules were internal Order information. He said nothing about this at the table. Said nothing while Molly fussed and Arthur asked quiet questions and Ron argued with Hermione about the sequencing of events at the Nocturne Alley end. He filed it, precisely and without drama, in the section of his head reserved for things that required thought before action. But he caught Kingsley's eyes across the table and saw the same thing in them. Kingsley had arrived at the same conclusion at roughly the same time. His face showed nothing, but his eyes said yes, I see it too, and we need to talk about it. They talked about it at 11 that night, library, the familiar configuration, but Ron was there now, which Harry had decided during dinner was the right move. What had happened in Diagon Alley had accelerated something. They couldn't continue with Ron on the outside of this conversation. He'd told Ron before the others arrived. Not everything. The key structure of it, the training, the second report, the analysis of Voldemort's strategy, the Horcrux theory. He'd told him straight, sitting in the corner of the library with the door closed, while the sounds of the house settling for the night came through the walls. Ron had listened. His face had done several things. Surprise, a complicated expression that was the start of being hurt followed by a deliberate overriding of it, the focused attention that was Ron's real face when he was taking something seriously. You should have told me earlier, Ron said. Yes, Harry said. I should have. I wouldn't have gone to Mum. Or Dumbledore. A pause. Well. Maybe Mum. But only if I thought, he stopped. I'm in. Obviously I'm in. But Harry, next time, yeah. Tell me next time. Next time, Harry said. I'm sorry. Ron accepted this in the way that Ron accepted apologies, practically, without architecture, moving straight on to what needed doing. Right. So. What's the plan? And now he sat at the library table with the others, and Harry explained what he'd seen in Diagon Alley and where it had taken him. The patrol schedule, Kingsley said, when Harry reached the relevant part. You're right. The timing of the attack corresponds to a specific window in the Order's deployment pattern. The minimum coverage point. Which means someone told them, Ron said. Or someone is observable enough in the Order's movement patterns that it doesn't require active intelligence, Hermione said, because she was always precise about the difference. But either way, the result is the same, the Death Eaters know our patterns and use them. We have to assume the patrol schedules aren't secure, Kingsley said. Which means changing them isn't enough. If we change them, whoever's observing will observe the change. So we give them a pattern to observe, Harry said. A false one. He looked at the map on the table. We put out a patrol schedule through the normal Order channels. We run a different actual schedule. He paused. But this requires knowing who's seeing the schedule information. Which means working out the leak first. Neville had been quiet through the first part of this. He spoke now. Rodolphus Lestrange, he said. The coordinator was Rodolphus Lestrange. He's been in Azkaban since 1981. He was released when Voldemort's people broke out. He looked at the table. His voice was steady. He was one of the 4 who tortured my parents. No one spoke. He was there to be identified, Neville said. Not by the Ministry. He knew Kingsley was there, he'd have known Kingsley would be on duty tonight, that's patrol schedule information. He looked at Kingsley. He was there to send a message to the Order. We are back. We are organized. And we know who you are. The quality of Neville's analysis was precise and cold and entirely unsentimental, and Harry watched the others register it, the recalibration that happened when people saw Neville working at full capacity rather than at the diminished capacity the world had spent years expecting from him. He's right, Harry said. It wasn't a raid. It was a letter. He looked at the map. The question is who was supposed to read it. Dumbledore, Kingsley said. Everything in the end is addressed to Dumbledore. Voldemort is telling Dumbledore that the rebuilt network is operational and deployed and knows the Order's internal structure well enough to exploit it. He paused. Which is also telling Dumbledore something about the leak, because the only way to know our patrol schedule is to have someone inside the Order's information flow. Or to have broken the communication cipher, Hermione said. That's possible, Kingsley conceded. But harder. The cipher was updated 2 months ago. By whom? Harry asked. A small silence. I updated it, Kingsley said slowly. Moody verified it. Distributed to Order members through, he stopped. Something shifted in his expression. Through what? Ron asked. Through Snape, Kingsley said, in the voice of someone who has just watched 2 pieces of a puzzle move toward each other in a way they aren't certain they like. The room was very still. Harry picked up his tea and drank some and set it down and looked at the table and said nothing, because there was a significant amount to think about before anyone said anything useful. Snape. The name sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples spreading out in multiple directions simultaneously. Harry had been sitting with Snape for 6 years, with his contempt, his cruelty, his specific targeting of Harry as a personal project, his cold intelligence, his unbreakable position as Dumbledore's most trusted agent. He had no affection for Snape and had never pretended to. But he also had the discipline, these days, to separate what he felt about someone from what he was able to assess about them. The case against Snape as a leak was obvious and substantial. Death Eater, former, proven and admitted, the mark was still on his arm. Access to Order information at a high level, Dumbledore trusted him completely, which meant he received more information than almost anyone in the room tonight. A personality that kept everyone at distance in a way that could be defensive or could be the specific social architecture of someone with things to hide. The case for Snape as loyal was also substantial. Dumbledore's certainty, which was not infallible but was not nothing, Dumbledore had spent his life reading people and his read of Snape was unshakable. The practical evidence of the First War, where Snape's information had apparently saved lives. His continued position as a teacher at Hogwarts, where Dumbledore had every opportunity to observe him closely. I don't know, Harry said, which was the most honest thing to say. I know, Hermione said, and everyone looked at her. I mean, I don't know if he's the leak. But I know that the answer has to be found through evidence and not assumption. Either way. She looked at Harry steadily. If we go after Snape on suspicion and we're wrong, we've lost whatever intelligence he provides and we've burned a relationship that, I think there's more to that relationship than any of us fully understand. Dumbledore's hand, Harry said. Hermione nodded. Exactly. He destroyed a Horcrux and his hand was, the injury required treatment. Medical treatment. I don't think the Order's field medics are equipped for that. Which means Snape treated it. She paused. Which means Snape knows about the Horcrux. Kingsley leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Dumbledore told him. Or Snape worked it out. Both are consistent with his capabilities. She tapped her quill on the table. The point is that Snape is not simply a hostile asset. He occupies a position in this war that we don't fully understand. And until we do, moving against him directly is dangerous. Harry looked at the map. At the question marks, at the red circles, at the blue marks for destroyed objects that cost something to destroy. We don't move against him, he said. We watch him. We get more information. He looked at Kingsley. That's the move, right now. Not confrontation. Information. Kingsley nodded. And in the meantime, we change how we operate internally. Nothing about our specific activity goes through the main order channel. Nothing. He looked around the table. This group operates on a need-to-know basis with the wider order. We share what supports the order's overall mission. We withhold what protects our own operation. Like Dumbledore does, Ron said, not quite bitterly, but approximately. Like Dumbledore does, Harry agreed. Except we're not going to pretend it isn't happening. He picked up the map and folded it with the deliberate, considered movements of someone deciding something. There's one more thing from tonight, he said. Hermione's shielding work, the layered charm. It's better than the standard order combat shield. Meaningfully better. I want everyone in this room to know it by the end of this week. He looked at Hermione. Can you teach it? Yes, she said. It's not complicated to learn. It's complicated to think of. Then think of more, Harry said. Think of every application you can see from the theory you've been reading. Combat, defensive, tactical. Write them down. We'll drill them. She looked at him for a moment and something in her expression shifted, the particular look she occasionally allowed herself, quickly suppressed, when something surprised her in a direction she hadn't expected. All right, she said. Neville, Harry said. Your memory, you know things you don't know you know. When we're going through the intelligence work, I want you to say everything, even the pieces that seem too small to matter. Especially those. Neville nodded. Ron. Harry looked at him. You saw the movement before anyone else tonight. At the far end. Your spatial awareness in a large engagement is, it's good. Better than you know. He meant it as assessment, not compliment, and Ron received it that way. I want you working on the tactical map with me. You think differently than I do about positioning. That's useful. Ron was quiet for a moment. Chess, he said. Chess, Harry agreed. He stood from the table. It was past midnight. The house was deep in its night silence. The map was folded in his hand and the library was full of people who had survived their first real engagement and come back thinking clearly, and that was something. That was in fact a great deal. One question before we stop, Neville said. Harry looked at him. Rodolphus Lestrange, Neville said. He was detained. He'll be in ministry custody. He won't stay there. He looked at the table. And when he's out, the next time he's in front of us, I want to be ready for him specifically. Not as a category. As him. It was said without drama. Without the weight of a vow or a declaration. Simply a practical requirement stated by someone who had decided what he was going to do with a very specific piece of information about his own history. I know his file, Kingsley said. His methods, his tells, his dueling habits. I'll put together everything I have. He looked at Neville steadily. You'll know him better than he knows himself. Neville nodded. Good, he said. And that was the end of the meeting. Harry was last out of the library. He stood for a moment at the table after the others had gone, looking at the folded map in his hand, and thought about Diagon Alley, the cobblestones and the broken glass, and the moment the Cruciatus curse had gone through empty air because he wasn't where it was aimed. He thought about how different this felt from every other time he'd been in danger. The fear had been there, a clean, functional fear that sharpened attention rather than clouding it, the fear you felt when you were doing something that mattered and the cost of failure was real. Not the paralyzing fear of being caught in something too large and too fast for his understanding. The other kind. The kind that meant he was present, competent, fighting for something he understood. He put the map in the canvas bag. He went upstairs. He slept, which was something he'd been doing consistently and well for 3 weeks, and which he recognized as its own kind of progress. Outside, London processed its Tuesday. Somewhere in the ministry, Rodolphus Lestrange sat in a holding cell and waited for whatever came next, and the machinery of an inadequate institution tried to decide what to do with someone it had failed to contain before. And somewhere in the network of safe houses and shadow movements that constituted Voldemort's rebuilt operation, a report was being compiled, about a response in Diagon Alley, about a group of people who had arrived before the ministry, about a 16-year-old who had moved through the engagement like someone who had been expecting it and prepared accordingly. Voldemort would read that report. Harry didn't know this yet. He would. Chapter 5, The Man with Two Masters. The Owl arrived on a Thursday morning, and it wasn't addressed to Harry. It was addressed to Kingsley, which was unremarkable. Kingsley received ministry correspondence regularly, order communications, occasional notes from contacts in the Aura division who still trusted him with their off-record observations. He received it, glanced at the seal, and his expression did something so small and controlled that only Harry, who had been watching Kingsley's face for 3 weeks with the specific attention of someone who has decided that this person is worth understanding precisely, caught it. The seal was plain black wax. No insignia. The letter itself, when Kingsley opened it at the kitchen table while Molly's back was turned, was 4 lines long. Kingsley read it, folded it once, and put it in his inner pocket. He looked up and found Harry watching him. "Library," Kingsley said. 10 minutes. Harry finished his toast. The letter had been written in a hand Harry recognized immediately, though he'd only seen it in marginalia, cramped, precise, each letter formed with the deliberate economy of someone who wrote quickly and hated wasted space. The blue ink hand from the ministry archive book. Moody's hand. Harry looked at Kingsley across the library table. Kingsley had the letter open in front of him now, pressed flat, and his expression had settled into something that was carefully, professionally neutral in a way that meant the content was not neutral at all. "Read it," Kingsley said. Harry read it. Snape came to me last night. Not through the order channel. Direct. He knows about the second report. Not the content, the existence. He wants to meet with HP specifically, not Dumbledore. He says the timing is critical and that he has information about the leak that cannot go through standard channels without triggering the problem it describes. I am not vouching for his motives. I am passing the message because not passing it seemed worse. He said to tell you, Celine Burke knew. Harry read it twice. Set it down. Celine Burke knew. The initials. SOB, Celine Orla Burke, married name Black. The woman whose books Harry had been reading for 6 weeks. The woman who had watched Voldemort more closely than anyone in the First Order and had died for it in 1979. She had known something. And Snape, who had been a student at Hogwarts during the First War, who had known Sirius and James and their whole generation, Snape apparently knew that she had known, and had known it long enough to hold it as a card he chose to play now, in this specific way, through Moody. How did he know about the second report? Harry said. I've been thinking about that since I read it. Kingsley leaned back. The report is sealed with a personal charm that I designed. No one else has the key. So he didn't read it. He paused. But he might have observed the behavior surrounding it. He's been in this house. Snape is considerably more observant than people remember to account for. He noticed the difference between how you act after a normal report and how you acted after Privet Drive, Harry said. Possibly. Or he noticed the specific dynamics of this group, the library meetings, the changed interactions. Snape has spent 16 years watching students and reading the rooms they occupy. He would notice a change in social architecture before most people registered it was happening. Kingsley looked at the letter. He went to Moody. Not Dumbledore. Because going to Dumbledore would close the conversation before it opened, Harry said. If Snape tells Dumbledore there's a second report, Dumbledore acts on it immediately, and whatever Snape is trying to accomplish with this, whatever position he's operating from, it becomes unavailable. He looked at the ceiling. He went to Moody because Moody is the one person in the Order whose loyalty to Dumbledore is absolute enough that Snape could use him as a channel without Moody deciding to take independent action, but who also has enough operational discipline to pass a message cleanly. You've thought about this a lot, Kingsley observed. I've been thinking about Snape since I was 11, Harry said, which was both joke and exact truth. He stood up. Picked the letter back up and read it a third time. He wants to meet with HP specifically. Not with Kingsley, not with a group, not through the Order. With Harry. Specifically. Which meant whatever Snape had to say, he'd decided, had calculated, that Harry was the right recipient. And Snape didn't make that kind of calculation carelessly. We meet him, Harry said. He's manipulative, calculating, and we don't know which side of this war he's actually on, Kingsley said. Those are the opening arguments against. Those are the arguments for why we're careful. Not for why we refuse. Harry set the letter down. Moody's involved now. That changes things. If we don't meet Snape and Moody finds out we declined after he passed the message, that damages our relationship with Moody. Which we'll need. He looked at Kingsley. And the thing about Celine Burke, that's not a manipulation. That's leverage. He wouldn't use that as a hook if he didn't have something real attached to it. Kingsley was quiet for a moment. You and me, he said. Not the others. You and me, Harry agreed. And we choose the location. Obviously. Kingsley took the letter back, folded it, and did something to it with his wand that reduced it to ash in his palm. I'll send word through Moody. Harry went to the door, then stopped. Kingsley. The second report, the section on Neville. Has Snape read about the prophecy from Dumbledore's side? Does he know the full content? Kingsley looked at him with the steady precision of someone who has considered this question in the dark. I think, he said slowly, that Snape knows more about the prophecy than anyone outside of Dumbledore and the seer who spoke it. Including you. A pause. I think that might be part of what he wants to discuss. Harry held this thought. Nodded once. Right, he said. Tomorrow night, then. He left Kingsley to arrange it. They met at the safe house on Marchmont Street, Kingsley's own space, which had the advantage of being known to him in complete detail and unknown to almost everyone else. He'd checked it 6 times before the meeting and had set a layered perimeter that would alert him to anything approaching with a dark magical signature, which was not an assurance of safety but was better than nothing. Harry arrived first. He sat in the chair that faced the door, which was the obvious choice and also the correct one, and waited. Kingsley arrived and settled near the window without sitting, which was his preferred position in uncertain situations. He'd once explained to Harry that standing near an exit point in a room during a tense meeting was a habit left over from 3 particularly difficult years in his 20s that he'd never been able to argue himself out of, and Harry had filed this alongside the other pieces of Kingsley's operating principles that he was quietly assembling. Snape arrived exactly on time. He came through the door with the specific quality of contained movement that Harry had watched him deploy for 6 years in Hogwarts corridors, robes settling, the stillness that was less composure than the absence of wasted motion, the dark eyes that moved immediately to Harry and then to Kingsley and then to the room's corners in a sequence that was automatic and revealed a man who checked exits the way other people breathed. He looked different outside of Hogwarts. Not dramatically different, he was still angular, still pale, still occupying space with the aggressive economy of someone who had decided long ago that comfort was a luxury he couldn't afford. But without the institutional authority of the school around him, without the potions dungeon and the teaching robes and the specific power structure he operated within there, he looked, Harry searched for the word and found it, exposed. Not vulnerable. Exposed. Like a mechanism visible without its casing. Potter, he said. Professor, Harry said. Something flickered across Snape's face at the title, something quick and complicated that Harry caught and couldn't fully interpret. He sat in the chair across from Harry without being invited, which was also Snape all over. I'll be brief, Snape said. I have perhaps 40 minutes before my absence becomes notable. Go ahead, Harry said. Snape looked at him for a moment with those black eyes, assessing, the particular assessment Harry had felt from Snape since first year, the perpetual calculation of someone deciding how much of what they know to deploy and in what order. Except that this time the calculation had a different quality to it. The contempt was absent, or suppressed, or had been temporarily set aside in favor of something more operational. He was looking at Harry the way Harry had seen Kingsley look at a field situation, reading the variables, determining the approach. The cipher breach, Snape said. The patrol schedule. You've identified that the Diagon Alley attack timing wasn't accidental. Yes, Harry said. The breach is not recent. It predates my distribution of the updated cipher by 3 months. Which means the cipher itself is not the primary vulnerability. He looked at Harry steadily. The primary vulnerability is in the Order's internal Patronus communication method. Not the messages themselves, they're clean. The metadata. Time of sending, from which location, to whom. Observed over sufficient time, this creates an accurate map of the Order's operational patterns without requiring the content of any single message. Kingsley made a sound that was not quite an exhale. Someone's been cataloging Patronus traffic. Someone has been cataloging Patronus traffic for approximately 8 months, Snape said. From a location that has access to the magical resonance signatures left by Patronus communication. Not an easy technique. Not widely known. He paused. It was used extensively during the First War. By both sides. I was aware of it because Albus used it to monitor Death Eater communication in 1977, and I was on the receiving end of that monitoring before I turned. His voice was flat. Factual. I recognized its use when I began seeing the pattern of Death Eater operational accuracy earlier this year. Who's doing it? Harry asked. I don't know with certainty, Snape said. What I know is that it requires sustained proximity to the Order's primary communication hub. That hub is this building. He looked around the room briefly. Or the person is mobile and has access to the primary senders. Which narrows it significantly. How narrow? Kingsley asked. Inner Order circle. 6 people, possibly 7. Snape's jaw tightened slightly. I am aware that I am on that list. I am telling you this because not acknowledging it would be insulting to everyone in this room. Harry looked at him. Are you the leak? The directness of it landed in the room. Snape met Harry's eyes without blinking. No, he said. Why should I believe that? You shouldn't, Snape said, which was unexpected enough that Harry felt the small recalibration it required. Not on the basis of my saying so. You should investigate it as you would any other hypothesis, by gathering evidence and following it where it leads. If the evidence leads to me, then you'll have your answer. If it doesn't, you'll have a different answer. He looked at Harry steadily. What I'm offering you tonight is not my innocence. I'm offering you the analytical framework for finding the truth. Those are different things. Fair, Harry said. Snape looked slightly startled, barely, but Harry caught it. You mentioned Celine Burke, Harry said. The quality of the pause that followed this was different from any other pause in the conversation. It had something in it, not softness, not grief, but the weight of something that had been carried for a long time. Where did you find the books? Snape said. Sirius's room. Hidden wardrobe. He had them. Snape looked at the table. I didn't know where they'd gone. After she died, her personal library should have passed to her family, but most of it disappeared. I assumed destroyed. Something moved in his face, controlled, but present. I was 19 when Celine Burke died. She was 32. She had been watching Voldemort up close for approximately 3 years, closer than anyone else in the Order, closer than Dumbledore knew, and significantly closer than was safe. What did she know? Harry asked. Snape looked at him. She knew about the Horcruxes. The room was very still. Not all of them, Snape continued. She knew the theory. She was a brilliant arithmancer. She'd worked through the logic of Voldemort's approach to immortality and arrived at soul division as the only mechanism that fit the evidence. She documented it. She was 3 years ahead of Dumbledore's investigation. His voice had the controlled quality of someone reciting facts they find painful but will not permit to derail the recitation. She brought her findings to Albus in 1978. He thanked her, told her the theory was interesting but speculative, and asked her to focus her intelligence work on Death Eater network mapping instead. Kingsley said, quietly, he didn't believe her. He believed her, Snape said. He simply wasn't ready. He was still hoping to resolve the war through direct confrontation, through Voldemort's defeat in the field rather than his theoretical unmaking. The Horcrux analysis required accepting that direct confrontation was insufficient. He wasn't prepared to accept that in 1978. A pause. She continued her investigation independently. She found what she believed to be 2 Horcruxes, the diary, which she couldn't access but had identified, and another object. She was killed before she could document what the second one was. Killed by whom? Harry asked. Not by Voldemort, Snape said. Or not directly. She was killed in an operation that was officially described as a Death Eater ambush. I believe it was specifically targeted. I believe someone told Voldemort what she was investigating. He looked at Harry. She had been very careful about who knew the details of her work. The people she trusted were a short list. The implication of this sat in the room for a moment. Dumbledore was on that list, Kingsley said. It wasn't a question. As was Moody, Snape said. And 3 others who are dead. He looked at the table. I have spent 26 years believing this was a coincidence or a consequence, that Voldemort was simply better at intelligence than we gave him credit for in 1979, and that Celine's proximity to him made her a target regardless of what she knew. He paused. Recent events have caused me to revisit that belief. The Patronus traffic monitoring, Harry said. Someone's been doing it for 8 months. The same technique Dumbledore used in 1977. He looked at Snape. You think it's the same person? I think, Snape said, very carefully, that the mechanics are identical in a way that suggests either the same practitioner or someone trained directly by that practitioner. And I think the list of people who were trained in that specific technique in that specific period is extremely short. He looked up. I am not accusing anyone. I am telling you what the evidence suggests and asking you to investigate it with the rigor it deserves. The silence that followed this was the most complicated silence of the evening. Harry looked at Snape and thought about 6 years of contempt and cruelty and the targeting that had been so personal it had sometimes felt like hatred wearing a pedagogical costume. He thought about Dumbledore's absolute certainty. He thought about the conversation in Dumbledore's office after the Ministry, where Dumbledore had used Snape's name as a marker of confidence. Severus is entirely trustworthy, I would stake my life on it. He thought about the dead woman's books in his canvas bag and the 3 lines Kingsley had written about Neville and the pattern of a war that looked different the longer you looked at it. He thought, this is either the most elaborate manipulation I've ever encountered, or it's a man who has been carrying an unbearable amount of information alone for a very long time and has run out of people he trusts to give it to. He wasn't sure which one it was. He was sure that not engaging with it was worse than engaging. Tell me what you know about the remaining Horcruxes, Harry said. Snape looked at him steadily. What do you know? The diary, destroyed. One other that Dumbledore destroyed, cost him his hand. The locket of Slytherin, currently missing from this building. Hufflepuff's cup, likely in the Lestrange vault at Gringotts. 2 more unknowns. He paused. Possibly Nagini. And possibly, and this is the one I keep coming back to, something connected to Ravenclaw, because Voldemort completed the set in his thinking. He wanted one from each founder. Snape's expression shifted, the barest movement, the adjustment of someone who has had their assessment of another person quietly upgraded. The diadem, Snape said. Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem. Lost for centuries. There are credible accounts that place it in the room of requirement at Hogwarts. He paused. I have not confirmed this. But the logic is consistent with what I know of his methods. He spent considerable time at Hogwarts before his return, in a role that gave him access to the castle's older spaces. When he came to interview for the defense position, Harry said. Yes. Dumbledore knows about the diadem. Dumbledore suspects, Snape said. He has not shared this with me directly, which means he is either testing what I report back or he is keeping it separate from anything he believes could be compromised. His voice was, for a moment, so precisely neutral that it served as its own kind of emotion. Harry registered this and moved on. Nagini. Almost certainly, Snape said. The snake has been with him since his earliest return to full form. She is not a normal animal. The connection between them is beyond the familiar bond. I believe the Horcrux creation occurred when he killed Bertha Jorkins, but I cannot confirm it. And the 7th, Harry said. If it's 7, there's one more that we haven't identified. Snape was quiet. His hands, which had been still on the table throughout the conversation, moved slightly, the smallest adjustment, attention entering them. Yes, he said. You know what it is. I have a theory, Snape said, that I have declined to examine too closely because the implications of it are considerable. He looked at Harry. The black eyes were very direct. There is a category of Horcrux creation that does not require intent. That can occur accidentally, under conditions of extreme magical violence and the presence of an already fragmented soul. Harry looked at him. The room was completely quiet. Somewhere outside London went about its evening business, indifferent and vast. Inside the safe house on Marchmont Street, something that had been circling the edges of Harry's awareness for weeks, since he'd started reading Celine Burke's journal, since he'd started thinking about the prophecy from every angle rather than the obvious one, that thing moved to the center. He looked at Snape and thought about the night on Privet Drive when he was 15 months old. He thought about a killing curse that should have worked and didn't. He thought about the specific way Voldemort's possession of him in the Ministry had felt from the inside, the access to his thoughts, the intimacy of it, that had nothing to do with legitimacy. He thought about the scar. He thought about Celine Burke's journal and its meticulous documentation of what a Horcrux looked like in practice, how it behaved, the quality of the magical signature it produced. He thought about the dreams. Say it, Harry said. His voice was even. Snape looked at him for a long moment. When Voldemort's killing curse struck you as an infant, he said, his soul was already fragmented to an extraordinary degree. The curse rebounded. The fragment that was dislodged by that rebound needed an anchor. He stopped. The scar is not simply a curse scar, Potter. It has never been simply a curse scar. The silence that followed was absolute. Harry sat with it. He did not fall apart. This was the thing that Snape was clearly braced for and that Kingsley was watching for. Harry sat with it and breathed and looked at the table and thought it through, and the not falling apart was not suppression. It was the result of 6 weeks of working alone in a garden and thinking about every hard thing until it had a shape, and this was the hardest thing, and it had the clearest shape of all. Which means to destroy all of them, Harry said, someone has to die. Or believes they do, Snape said. Something had shifted in his voice, very slightly. The flatness had developed a texture. I have been working on this problem for 2 years. There are aspects of Horcrux theory that Dumbledore's research has not explored fully. Specifically, the question of whether a Horcrux anchored in a living host can be excised without destroying the host. He paused. I have not reached a definitive conclusion. I have reached the beginning of a possible conclusion, which is insufficient, but it is not nothing. Harry looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because, Snape said, and the word came out with a quality of weight behind it, Dumbledore knows. He has known for at least a year. And he has not told you. And he intends to use you as a means to an end that you have not consented to because you don't know it exists. The fury in Harry's chest was clean and cold and he did not act on it. He let it move through him the way he'd learned to let difficult things move through him, feeling it completely without letting it drive. He thinks I have to die, Harry said. He thinks it may be necessary, Snape said. He is preparing you for a war he believes you will survive only up to a certain point. The lessons he plans, the Horcrux investigation, he will walk you to the edge of it and then he will need you to walk off the edge yourself. Without having told you why. That's why he wants the connection deepened between us, Harry said slowly. The private lessons. Understanding Riddle's history. He wants me to be willing. To have enough context to go willingly when the moment comes. His jaw was tight. He's preparing me to sacrifice myself and he's doing it with my consent manufactured in advance rather than genuine. Kingsley, very quietly, said something in a language Harry didn't speak. It sounded like a profanity. This is, Hermione's voice said from the doorway, the most disturbing thing I have ever heard. Both Harry and Kingsley turned. Hermione was in the doorway with her coat on and her arms folded and the expression of someone who had been standing there long enough to have heard the significant part of what had just been said. She looked at Harry and then at Snape and then back at Harry. I followed you, she said to Harry. I wasn't spying. I was worried. You left without telling anyone where you were going and she stopped. I've been standing there for about 10 minutes. She looked at Snape. You know about the excision theory, she said. The possibility of removing a Horcrux from a living host. I have the beginning of it, Snape said. He was looking at Hermione with an expression Harry had rarely seen him direct at a student, something that wasn't quite respect but was in the vicinity of it. The flaw in Dumbledore's sacrifice model, Hermione said, moving into the room without being invited, which was so specifically Hermione that under other circumstances Harry would have smiled, is that it assumes the Horcrux and the host consciousness are inseparable once established. But that's not what the theory actually states. It states that they're inseparable under normal conditions. The conditions of the original killing curse were not normal. The anchor point was created by a rebounded curse in a host with its own significant magical protection. She looked at Snape. The protection that Lily Potter's sacrifice created. That same protection is still active. It's been active for 16 years. And it might be precisely what makes the excision possible, rather than what makes the Horcrux stable. The room was quiet. Snape was looking at Hermione the way mathematicians looked at an unexpected proof. You arrived at this independently, he said. I arrived at the edge of it, she said. I've been reading everything I can find about Horcrux theory and the question kept being, why did the scar form? A normal curse scar doesn't have a magical signature. Harry's does. Everyone who's done a diagnostic spell on it knows it does. The signature is, she hesitated. It's partly Voldemort's. But it's partly something else. Something older. The protection. And the protection, Snape said, is love. Which is magic Voldemort cannot understand or manipulate. Which means the Horcrux is isolated within it, Hermione said. Like a tumor encapsulated by the body's own immune response. Not integrated. Contained. She looked at Harry. It can potentially be removed without killing me, Harry said. Potentially, she said. Potentially. He looked at her. Looked at Snape. Looked at Kingsley, who was standing by the window with the expression of someone who has just watched a map of something he thought he understood completely reshape itself. He thought about the second report, which kept growing. He thought about the journal of Celine Burke and what she'd known and what it had cost her. He thought about Dumbledore, who loved him, he genuinely believed Dumbledore loved him, and who was preparing him to die with that love as the anesthetic. Snape, Harry said. Potter. The excision theory. How long do you need to develop it to a workable conclusion? Snape looked at him steadily. Months, possibly. It requires Dumbledore's research as a foundation, which means either I access it without his knowledge or he shares it, Harry said. Willingly. Because we ask him to. He looked at the table. We're going to have a conversation with Dumbledore. Not yet. When we're ready. And we're going to put everything on the table. He looked up. Including what you've told me tonight. Snape was quiet for a moment. He will not be pleased that I came to you directly. No, Harry said. He won't. He looked at Snape. Do you trust him? The question landed and Snape sat with it in the particular way of someone who has thought about this question so many times that it no longer has a simple surface. I trust his intentions, Snape said. I do not trust his methods. I trust his intelligence. I do not trust his certainty. He paused. I trust that he would sacrifice himself for this war without hesitation. A longer pause. I do not trust that he has fully considered what it costs him nothing to sacrifice in others. Harry nodded slowly. Will you continue? Harry asked. Working with us, what we're doing here. Not against the order. Alongside it. Snape looked at him with the black eyes that had been reading him since first year and finding him wanting. Now they read him differently, the same precision, the same assessment, but aimed at something it hadn't aimed at before. What we are doing, Snape said, and the pronoun shift was very deliberate, is the only useful thing anyone in this war is currently doing. He paused. Yes. I'll continue. Good. Harry stood. One more thing. He looked directly at Snape and said this without softness and without anger, because both would have been wrong for the moment. Everything you've told me tonight, I believe it. I'm not certain I'm right to believe it. But I'm operating on the assumption that you're telling the truth until evidence says otherwise. And if evidence says otherwise, he paused. You know what I'm capable of. You saw the Diagon Alley report. Snape's expression was unreadable for exactly 1 second. Then something moved in it, very small, very controlled, the adjustment of a man receiving something he hadn't expected and didn't have a prepared response for. Yes, he said. I know what you're capable of. He looked at Harry and then said, precisely and without evident difficulty, you're considerably more than your father was at your age. The room absorbed this. It was not, Harry understood, a simple statement. It was a very complicated one from a man for whom the comparison to James Potter was never simple, and the fact that he had made it, accurately, without the contempt that would have distorted it, as a clean assessment, said something about this conversation and what it had been and what it had changed. I know, Harry said simply, and didn't make it more than it was. Snape stood. Adjusted his robes. Looked at Kingsley. The Patronus traffic monitoring, investigate it carefully. Approach it as you would a live surveillance operation. Don't change any patterns yet. Just observe. He moved toward the door. And Potter. Harry looked at him. The journal, Snape said. Celine's journal. There's an entry near the back, the last third, written in a different ink than the rest. She used a concealment charm on it that I taught her, in 1976, before everything. The charm requires the caster's magical signature to lift. He paused. It requires my signature. He looked at Harry steadily. She left it for me, and I never had the books to find it. Harry thought about the journal in his canvas bag at Grimmauld Place. I'll bring it to you, he said. Something crossed Snape's face that wasn't visible for long enough to name. Thank you, he said. He left. The door closed. The three of them stood in a safe house in the silence that follows a conversation that has changed the shape of something significant, and Hermione sat down in the nearest chair and pressed her hands against her eyes briefly. Right, she said. So. Yeah, Harry said. Dumbledore he's been guiding you toward a death he thinks is necessary, she said. Snape thinks there might be a way around it. You might be a Horcrux. And the leak in the Order is possibly someone who has been there since the First War, using a technique that Dumbledore himself developed. She took her hands away from her eyes. And there's a hidden section in Celine Burke's journal that Snape hasn't read yet. Yes, Harry said. I'm not, she stopped. I'm not panicking. I just want to say that out loud. I'm not panicking. I know you're not, Harry said. It's quite a lot to not panic about. I know, Harry said. Kingsley moved from the window, finally, and picked up his coat. We go back. We don't change anything in our external behavior. We continue exactly as we have been, and tomorrow we start looking into the Patronus traffic question, and we get the journal to Snape. He looked at Harry. And we prepare for Dumbledore. Yes, Harry said. All of it. He thought about Celine Burke's journal sitting in his bag at Grimmauld Place, with its hidden pages that a dead woman had left for a 19-year-old she trusted, and that the 19-year-old, now a grown man, carrying 26 years of something heavy, had never found. He thought about the shape of this war and how much of it was built from the things people had known and not shared, the things they'd carried alone because they didn't know who was safe, the things that had died with them because the right person hadn't been in the room at the right moment. He was in the room. He intended to stay in it. Let's go home, he said. Chapter 6, Before the Storm. The hidden section of Celine Burke's journal was 17 pages long. Harry delivered the journal to Snape the following evening, through a chain that involved Moody as intermediary and a handoff at the back of a Muggle bookshop in Charing Cross Road that Snape had specified in a note that arrived and disintegrated within 30 seconds of being read. Harry had copied out the visible portions of the journal's final third first, everything up to the concealment charm's boundary, which manifested as pages that felt normal but showed only blank parchment. He'd been thorough about it. He wasn't giving Snape the only copy of anything. Snape received the journal without ceremony, lifted the concealment charm in the time it took Harry to button his coat, and read the first of the 17 pages standing in the bookshop's history section with the expression of someone receiving something they'd been waiting for long enough that the waiting had become structural. He read for 6 minutes without speaking. Then he closed the journal and said, very quietly, to the bookshelf in front of him rather than to Harry, she found the locket. The Slytherin locket, Harry said. She tracked it to a cave on the coast. She documented the protections around it, the basin, the inferi in the lake, the potion. She documented all of it. In 1978. He turned the journal over in his hands. Albus found the same cave in June. He went alone. Something in his voice had developed a thin, sharp edge. He nearly died, and he went alone, and if he had read her research he would have known exactly what he was walking into and he would not have had to guess his way through it. He didn't know the journal existed, Harry said. No, Snape said. He knew she had research. He declined to pursue it thoroughly when she was alive. After she died, Sirius had the books, and Sirius was in Azkaban 12 years later, and by the time Sirius was relevant again the books were in a hidden wardrobe and nobody was looking. He looked up at Harry. Nobody was looking because the people who might have known to look were dead or imprisoned or had decided, for reasons that made perfect sense at the time, not to look too hard at things that might destabilize their understanding of what happened in 1979. Harry thought about the timeline. You suspected something about her death, he said. Even then. Even at 19. I suspected something, Snape said. I had no evidence. I had a feeling, which was worthless, and a list of people who knew what she was working on, which was, I was 19. I was also, at that point, 3 months into a situation with Dumbledore that required me to trust him completely or not at all. I chose completely. He paused. I have no evidence now that the suspicion was correct. I have only the pattern, and patterns are suggestive rather than conclusive. I know, Harry said. Read the rest of it, Snape said, and gave the journal back. Harry read the rest of it on the tube back to Grimmauld Place, sitting between two muggles who had no idea what was in his hands, and by the time he reached King's Cross he had read all 17 pages twice and had the beginning of an answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. The next 3 days moved with the particular quality of time before something large, fast in some places, stretched thin in others, the texture of waiting that wasn't passive but charged, like the air before weather arrives. Hermione worked through the excision theory with the focused intensity of someone who has found the problem worth solving, covering the library table with notes that built on each other in layers, Snape's analytical framework meeting her own research in a way that produced something neither of them had arrived at independently. She sent questions to Snape through Moody's channel and received answers within hours, which suggested to Harry that Snape was also working quickly and considered this urgent. Ron and Neville drilled every morning. The training had shifted, less individual work, more combined exercise, the two of them learning to operate as a unit, which was slower and more complicated than individual training but was also what actually mattered. Harry ran them through the engagement patterns from Diagon Alley repeatedly, identifying the moments where the four of them had operated well and the moments where they'd been lucky, and there had been one or two of the latter that he wasn't willing to pretend were the former. Kingsley investigated the Patronus traffic question with the methodical patience of someone who had spent 15 years building cases and knew that evidence built slowly or it didn't build at all. He said nothing about what he was finding until he had something solid, which was both professionally correct and quietly maddening. Harry read Celine Burke's 17 hidden pages again, and came back each time to the same section, her final entry, written in a cramped, fast hand that suggested urgency, dated 3 days before she died. The Horcrux in the cave cannot be the locket itself, she had written. I was wrong about this. The locket is a container, and the container is devastating enough, but the real object of power is what V has done to his own soul in the making of it. The locket is a landmark. The soul is the map. He has made himself into a geography. And the thing that frightens me most, the thing I can't find a way around in the theory, is that the geography requires a host that wasn't chosen. It happened at least once. Probably the night of the Longbottom prophecy, when he first heard it and his intent fractured something already fractured. The host didn't die. Which means he has one anchor he cannot locate, control, or destroy. And if that anchor ever understands what it is, if the host ever has the capacity to act on that understanding consciously, the entry stopped there. 3 days before she died. Harry read it the 4th time and thought, she knew. She had pieced it together from the theory side, without the specific event, and she had known. And she had written it down and left it hidden for someone she trusted, and that someone had found it 26 years later in a Muggle bookshop. He thought about what Hermione had said, the protection creating an encapsulation rather than an integration. He thought about what Snape had said about excision. He thought about the scar, which he had lived with for 16 years as a mark of something that had happened to him, and which was, apparently, also something that lived inside him with its own agenda. He decided, sitting with all of this for the 4th consecutive morning, that he was going to stop thinking about it alone. He went downstairs and found everyone at breakfast and said, "Library. Now, please. All of you." Molly looked up from the stove. He met her eyes. She held the look for a moment, reading something in his face, and then she turned back to the stove and said nothing, which was its own specific kind of blessing. He told them everything. All of it. The 17 pages of Celine's hidden journal, the excision theory and where Snape and Hermione had taken it, the specific possibility that he carried a fragment of Voldemort's soul in the scar he'd had since he was 15 months old. He put it on the table the way he put everything on the table now, directly, without ceremony, without managing how it landed. Ron went white and stayed white for the duration and didn't say anything, which for Ron was the most extreme version of taking something seriously that existed. Neville was very still in the way he'd been still when Harry had told him about the prophecy, receiving it, processing it, not collapsing under it. Hermione already knew the shape of it, but hearing Harry say it out loud in plain language produced something in her face that she turned away briefly to manage. She turned back after 2 seconds and was entirely composed, and he loved her for both the turning away and the turning back. "You're not panicking," Ron said finally, looking at Harry. "No," Harry said. "Why aren't you panicking?" "I'm panicking on your behalf." "Because Hermione and Snape think there's a way around it," Harry said. "And because panicking doesn't help, and I've got better things to do with the energy." Ron looked at him for a long moment. When did this happen? Where's the Harry who used to panic appropriately?" "Surrey," Harry said. "He stayed in Surrey." Ron looked like he had several more things to say about this, decided this wasn't the moment for any of them, and ate his toast with the focused application of someone who needs to do something with their hands. "The immediate question," Hermione said, pulling them forward, "is Dumbledore. We have the Patronus traffic investigation, Snape's information about the Horcrux situation, and what we now know from Celine's journal. Individually, these are significant. Together they form a complete picture. Dumbledore needs to see the complete picture." She looked at Harry. "You've been saying when we're ready. Are we ready?" Harry thought about it. Really thought about it, not whether he was emotionally ready, which was irrelevant, but whether they had enough to walk into that conversation and hold their ground. They had Kingsley's intelligence work. They had Hermione and Snape's excision theory, which was not yet complete but was far enough along to present. They had Celine's journal. They had the Patronus traffic analysis, incomplete but significant. They had 6 weeks of map work, strategic analysis, Horcrux research, and the small, crucial fact of Diagon Alley, where they'd moved faster and more effectively than the Ministry's professional Aurors, where they'd captured a senior Death Eater, where they'd demonstrated that what Harry had been building in a garden in Surrey was not theoretical. "Yes," Harry said. "We're ready." "I'll send word to Dumbledore," Kingsley said. "No," Harry said. "I will." He wrote the letter himself. Single page, direct. No pleasantries beyond a greeting, no elaborate framing. "Professor Dumbledore, I'd like to meet with you privately. There are things I need to tell you and things I need to hear from you, and I think we both know there are enough of both to make this conversation overdue. I'm available whenever you are." Harry he sent it with Hedwig, who had been restless from the reduced correspondence of the summer and left with the unmistakable enthusiasm of an owl given purpose. She was back in 4 hours with a reply that was 2 sentences long: "Harry, tomorrow afternoon, 4 o'clock, here at Hogwarts. I'll have tea ready. Albus." The brevity of it told Harry something. Dumbledore wrote long when he was managing. Short meant he was responding to something real. Harry went to bed early and slept well, and in the morning trained with Neville and ate breakfast with the Weasleys and didn't spend any of the intervening time rehearsing what he was going to say, because he had found over the past weeks that rehearsed conversations produced worse outcomes than conversations he walked into knowing what he knew and trusting himself to articulate it. Kingsley drove him to Hogsmeade in a Muggle car, an experience that revealed Kingsley as a surprisingly aggressive driver in a way that Harry filed away as delightfully incongruous, and they walked up to the castle in the late afternoon light, the grounds empty of students, the school in its summer state of quiet readiness, the way institutions looked when the people who gave them purpose were temporarily absent. McGonagall met them at the entrance. She looked at Harry with the expression she had been deploying since his first year, the one that contained equal parts concern, expectation, and a kind of determined belief that he couldn't always account for. "Mr. Potter," she said. "He's in his office." She looked at Kingsley. "Shacklebolt. Minerva." Kingsley's tone said several things simultaneously in the way that people who have worked alongside each other for years could manage without effort. McGonagall looked between them. "I won't ask," she said, which meant she already had a significant idea and was choosing her moment. She stood aside and let them through. Dumbledore's office was exactly as Harry had always known it, the portraits, the instruments, the pervasive sense of a space that had been inhabited by someone very specific for a very long time. Fawkes was on his perch and regarded Harry with the bright, unsentimental intelligence of a creature that had seen too much of human history to be impressed by any particular instance of it but remained engaged with all of it. Dumbledore stood when they came in. He looked older than he had at the ministry, though it had only been weeks. The hand was visible, dark, withered, held slightly away from his body with the careful positioning of someone managing pain they'd decided not to treat any further. "Harry," he said. "Kingsley." He gestured to the chairs, and they sat, and he sat across from them, and there was tea, which Harry drank and which gave his hands something to do in the first 30 seconds while the room settled around the fact of why they were there. "Before you begin," Dumbledore said, "I want to say something." Harry waited. "I have known for approximately 2 weeks that something significant has been occurring," Dumbledore said, "outside of my direct awareness. I have not intervened." He looked at Harry steadily. This was a deliberate choice. Harry looked at him. "Why?" "Because the last time I intervened in your life comprehensively, the last time I managed your circumstances completely and kept information from you for what I believed were sound protective reasons, it contributed directly to Sirius's death." His voice was even. Not self-flagellating, not performing guilt. Simply accurate. "I made that calculation and I was wrong, and I have been living with what it cost. I decided that observing what you chose to do independently, rather than interrupting it, was at minimum less likely to cause that specific category of harm." Harry held this. It was, he thought, the most honest thing Dumbledore had ever said to him directly, and it required the kind of honest response it had been given. "You've been watching," Harry said. "Observing. With some distance. I knew about the library meetings. I knew Kingsley had developed a different relationship with you than his official role described. I did not know the specifics." He looked at Harry with those blue eyes that were, today, fully present and unguarded in a way Harry had rarely encountered. "I think it's time I did." "Yes," Harry said. "It is." He started talking. He laid it out in the order that would be clearest, not the order it had happened, the strategic analysis first, the Horcrux research second, Snape's information third. He talked about Celine Burke's journal and its hidden pages. He talked about the excision theory. He talked about the Patronus traffic breach and the implications of the technique being one Dumbledore had developed and used in 1977. Dumbledore listened. He had the quality, when he truly listened, of complete absorption, not the performed attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak but genuine receipt, the kind that processed everything and held it. He did not interrupt. He did not redirect. He let Harry finish. When Harry stopped, the office was very quiet. Fawkes made a small sound and settled on his perch. One of the instruments nearby ticked steadily. "The concealment charm on Celine's journal," Dumbledore said. "It required Severus's signature." "Yes. She trusted him with it." He looked at his damaged hand. "I did not read her research thoroughly when she brought it to me in 1978, he said. "This is not a justification, I am acknowledging a failure of judgment that had lasting consequences." He looked up. "I was protecting a specific approach to this war that I was not willing to revise, and I used her research as partial confirmation of what I already believed rather than allowing it to challenge the framework." He paused. "I have spent the years since her death believing this was a tactical error. I am now considering whether it may have been more consequential than that." "The person using the Patronus monitoring technique," Kingsley said. He had been quiet through Harry's presentation and now spoke with the careful precision of someone who has assembled evidence and is presenting it rather than accusing. "The technique was developed by you and used internally in 1977. The list of people trained in it is very short. I've been investigating the pattern of order intelligence breaches over the past 8 months, and there is a consistent quality to what has been leaked. It is always operational without being strategic. Always enough to disrupt without being enough to destroy. It is the profile of someone who is managing a balance. Dumbledore was very still. Someone who has two allegiances, Harry said. And is trying to keep both viable. He looked at Dumbledore directly. Not Snape. Snape's information has never been the leak, I checked. The engagements where the order was hit correspond to periods where Snape was operating undercover in a way that would have made passing operational details impossible. He paused. I want to tell you who I think it is. But I want you to hear the evidence first and arrive there yourself. Because I think you need to. Dumbledore's expression was extraordinary. It moved through several things that Harry had never seen on that face, a real uncertainty, a genuine discomfort, the quality of a man confronting a possibility he has been not looking at for longer than he would like to admit. Tell me the evidence, Dumbledore said. Kingsley laid it out. Clean, methodical, without drama. The timing correlations, the technique signature, the specific pattern of what was leaked and what was protected, the two instances where the breach had been so precisely calibrated that it read as intentional restraint. He laid all of it out and let it sit. The name arrived in the room without either of them saying it, the way conclusions sometimes did, present before it was spoken. Dumbledore closed his eyes briefly. Opened them. I see, he said. I'm sorry, Harry said, and meant it. Don't be, Dumbledore said. You found what I should have found. He stopped. Began again. I am grateful you told me, and I am aware of how inadequate that is. It's not inadequate, Harry said. It's the truth. Dumbledore looked at him. Something in his expression had shifted significantly, the authority was still there, the intelligence, the weight of years, but they were arranged differently, as though Harry's presence had shifted their configuration. The Horcrux, Dumbledore said, and his voice had a quality that was steady and deliberate in a way that required effort. In the scar. You knew, Harry said. I suspected with a very high degree of certainty, Dumbledore said. I have known for approximately 14 months. He held Harry's gaze. I did not tell you because you needed me to be willing, Harry said. When the time came. You needed me to walk into it with enough understanding of the war to choose it. You were building toward telling me. But you were going to tell me as late as possible, so I didn't have time to look for a way out. The silence that followed this was very long. Yes, Dumbledore said. Simply and completely. No qualification. Harry breathed. I'm not angry, he said, which was not entirely true but was more true than the alternative framing. I understand why. I can see the logic of it. A 16-year-old told he carries a piece of Voldemort's soul and that he may have to die for it to be destroyed, without a possible alternative. Yes, I can see why you'd manage the information. He paused. But Dumbledore. Managing me nearly cost Sirius his life. Continued management could cost more. He looked at the old man across the desk with the directness that had become natural to him over the past weeks. I am not a child to be protected from hard truths. I haven't been for a while. And I think you know that. I know that, Dumbledore said, quietly. I have known it for some time. The habit of protection is, he paused. It is very hard to release, when the person you are protecting is someone whose death would represent a failure of your own. I'm not your failure to manage, Harry said. I'm your ally. If you can adjust to that. The room was very still. Yes, Dumbledore said. I can adjust to that. He looked at Harry steadily. The excision theory. Tell me where Severus and Miss Granger have taken it. Harry told him. Dumbledore listened with absolute attention, and twice he asked a precise question that told Harry his mind was already working on the problem from the inside, supplementing the framework with knowledge he held that Snape and Hermione hadn't had access to. By the end of it he was leaning forward with his elbows on the desk and his damaged hand forgotten, and there was something in his face that Harry hadn't seen there before. Hope, without management. Raw and functional and real. It is possible, Dumbledore said. I had not. I had taken the sacrifice model as given because the theory did not suggest an alternative. But the original conditions of the killing curse that night, I had not fully applied what I know about your mother's protective magic to the excision question. He looked at Harry. If the protection forms an encapsulating boundary rather than an integrating one, if the fragment is essentially isolated within the magical signature of an act of love, then the extraction mechanism is not violence. It is something considerably more elegant. He paused. And considerably more in keeping with what I know of how this kind of magic actually functions. Can it be done? Harry asked. I believe so, Dumbledore said. I will need Severus's research notes and Miss Granger's cross-references. I will need to perform several diagnostic analyses that I should have performed long ago. He met Harry's eyes. And I will need you to understand that until we are completely certain, the possibility of sacrifice must remain in the plan. I am not removing it until I can replace it with certainty. That's fair, Harry said. I can live with that. The choice of words landed in the room and Dumbledore smiled, small, real, the smile of someone who has received something they needed. I should think so, he said. They stayed at Hogwarts for 3 hours. In the second hour, Dumbledore shared his research freely, the full Horcrux investigation, documented over 4 years, with the care and precision of a man who had been building a case alone and was now handing it to people who would help him finish it. He confirmed the locket, the cup, the diadem's probable location. He confirmed his belief about Nagini. He documented the object he had destroyed, a ring, Gaunt family heirloom, and the cost of destroying it had been severe enough that it was immediately clear why his hand looked the way it did. Kingsley took notes in the tight, accurate shorthand of a trained orar. Harry asked questions. Dumbledore answered all of them completely, without omission, without curation, and this quality of genuine sharing, of an exchange rather than a dispensation, was different in kind from every conversation Harry had previously had with him. In the third hour, they talked about what came next. The internal breach, Dumbledore said. I need to address it personally. I need to, he stopped. It will require a conversation that I am not looking forward to. But it must happen before we move on any Horcrux. I agree, Kingsley said. The leak itself has been managed rather than exploited, Dumbledore said. Which means the person doing it believes they are balancing something, that their continued access to the order is worth more protected than burned. Which means we have time to address it correctly rather than reactively. He looked at Kingsley. I will need your full documentation. You'll have it tonight, Kingsley said. The broader group you've assembled, Dumbledore said, looking at Harry. Neville. I should have, he paused. Neville Longbottom has been involved for how long? Since shortly after I arrived at Grimmauld Place, Harry said. Dumbledore nodded slowly. The prophecy, he said. The question of the second candidate. This is something I have also been not looking at, for reasons that, he looked at his hand. For reasons that were about protecting him from a burden rather than acknowledging that he already carries it and would be better served by knowledge than ignorance. He looked at Harry. You told him. Yes. How did he receive it? Like Neville, Harry said. Which means he took it seriously and immediately asked what we were going to do about it. Dumbledore closed his eyes briefly again. When he opened them there was something in them that was not quite grief and not quite admiration and was probably both. He should be here for the next conversation, Dumbledore said. All of them should. I owe all of you, a different approach than I have been taking. He paused. I am capable of it. I have simply not been doing it. Those are different problems with different solutions. Yes, Harry said. They are. He stood. Kingsley stood. Fawkes on his perch watched them with those bright eyes that had watched everything. One more thing, Harry said. He reached into the canvas bag and produced the second report, the full text of it, the sealed parchment that Kingsley had been building and adding to since the first night in the garden at Privet Drive. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had gone into it, every observation, every analysis, every honest thing that hadn't been said in the official channels. He set it on the desk. "This is the report that wasn't addressed to you," Harry said. "It is now." He met Dumbledore's eyes. "Because the reason it wasn't addressed to you was that we needed time to develop what it described. We needed to be sure of what we'd found before we brought it to you. We're sure now." Dumbledore looked at the sealed parchment. He reached out and touched it but did not open it. "Kingsley wrote this," he said. "Kingsley started it," Harry said. "The rest of us contributed. It covers everything, the Horcrux analysis, the strategic assessment of Voldemort's rebuilt network, the Diagon Alley engagement, the excision theory, the Patronus breach investigation, the observations about Neville, and," he paused. "Celine Burke's journal. A summary of all 17 pages. Because she deserves to be in the record." Dumbledore was very still. He looked at the report for a long time. "She does," he said quietly. "She very much does." He looked up at Harry. "I will read this tonight," he said. "And tomorrow, if you're willing, I would like to meet with all of you. The full group." "We're willing," Harry said. The drive back to London was quieter than the drive up, but it was a different quality of quiet, not tense, not burdened, but the quiet of two people who have done something significant and are sitting with the completion of it. "Well," Kingsley said, "somewhere near Brent Cross." "Yeah," Harry said. "He took it well." "He took it honestly," Harry said. "Which is better than well." Kingsley drove in silence for a moment. "You told him about the report." "The report was always going to go to him eventually," Harry said. "The point was never to keep it from him permanently. The point was to develop something real before we brought it forward." He looked out at London resolving itself from motorway to city, the familiar sprawl of it, the vastness of a place that had no idea what was being built and broken within its borders. He needed to see that we'd done genuine work. Not just, here is a 16-year-old who has decided he knows better. Here is what we built. Here is the evidence. Here is the analysis. Here is the conclusion. He paused. Authority responds to demonstrated competence. Even when the authority is Dumbledore. Especially when, Kingsley said. They pulled off the main road, navigating the back streets toward Grimmauld Place. "The second report," Kingsley said. "How did it feel? Giving it to him?" Harry thought about it. "Right," he said. "It felt right." He paused. The point of it was never to be a weapon. It was a record, an honest record of what was real, separate from what was officially reported. It was the thing that needed to exist before the conversation could happen. He looked at Kingsley. "You knew that, from the night you wrote the first line." "I knew I needed to write down what I'd seen," Kingsley said. "Where it went from there, that developed." "As things do," Harry said. Kingsley parked 2 streets from Grimmauld Place, in the way they'd all learned to do, and they walked the rest of the way in the warm evening air, the city summer heat still rising from the pavement, the street full of ordinary people doing ordinary things with an entirely ordinary Tuesday evening. Harry thought about being 8 years old in a cupboard, thinking about spiders and cars and trying to understand the system of things. He thought about a garden in Surrey and 6 objects hovering in the rain and the first person who had looked at what he was doing and not looked away. He thought about Sirius's books and Celine Burke's hidden pages and Snape saying considerably more than your father in a quiet bookshop and meaning it as a gift rather than a comparison. He thought about Neville on the back step with his herbology text. Hermione in the doorway of the safe house with her arms folded and the most important thing she'd ever deduced coming out of her mouth. Ron eating 3 sandwiches and then asking sharp, excellent questions. Kingsley at a narrow desk at 4 in the morning writing down everything he'd seen because looking away felt like a specific and unacceptable kind of failure. He thought about tomorrow, Dumbledore's office, the full group, the conversation that would be different in kind from every conversation the Order had ever had because the people in it were going to be treated as what they actually were. Grimmauld Place appeared at the end of the street. The light in the kitchen was on, which meant Molly, which meant food, which meant the warm and complicated shelter of a house full of people who were all, in their different ways, trying to hold something together. He stopped on the pavement for a moment. "Kingsley," he said. Kingsley stopped beside him. "The second report, what you wrote at the end of it. On the first night." Harry looked at him. "You wrote, he's not preparing to survive this war. He's preparing to win it." "I remember," Kingsley said. "Was that an assessment," Harry said, "or a decision?" Kingsley looked at him steadily. "Both," he said. "Always both." Harry nodded. They went inside. The kitchen was exactly what it always was, full and warm and smelling of something Molly had been cooking since 5 o'clock, and Ron was already at the table arguing mildly with Ginny about something that was probably Quidditch, and Hermione was reading with one eye on the door, and Neville was sitting quietly at the end of the table with a cup of tea and the particular settled quality he'd been developing over the past weeks, a groundedness replacing the old apology that had once lived in his posture. They all looked up when Harry and Kingsley came in. Harry looked at them. These specific people, this specific, improbable, careful, capable collection of people who had found each other in a library and a back garden and a Muggle bookshop and had built something real out of the material they'd been given. "Dumbledore wants to meet with all of us tomorrow," he said. "Full group. No partial information. No curated briefings." He sat down. "He's going to share everything he has. We're going to share everything we have. And we're going to build the second half of this war from a complete picture, with everyone in the room." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "About time," Hermione said. "Finally," Neville said. Ron leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who has been waiting for an adult to do the right thing for long enough that the actual event has become almost anticlimactic. "So we're doing this properly," he said. "We're doing this properly," Harry said. Molly put a plate in front of him without comment. He ate, and the kitchen refilled with its ordinary noise, and outside London went about its enormous, indifferent, entirely unaware business. The war was coming. It had been coming for 16 years. Everything Harry had ever survived had been preparation for it, some of the preparation chosen and some of it simply endured, but all of it, the cupboard and the garden and the cave and the ministry and the graveyard and the darkness and the loss, all of it had been pointing toward this. He was ready. Not because he was certain of surviving it. He'd sat with the question of his own death long enough to have stopped being afraid of it in the paralyzing sense, to have metabolized it into something functional, something that clarified rather than clouded. If the excision worked, he lived. If it didn't, he'd decided, in a garden in Surrey, in the rain, that he was done asking for permission to be fully what he was, and that included the capacity to walk into the hardest thing with his eyes completely open. But he thought it would work. He thought Hermione and Snape, between them, were going to solve the problem that Celine Burke had been 3 lines away from solving in 1978, the problem that had been sitting in the theory for 47 years waiting for the right minds to apply to it. He thought the combination of his mother's magic and a dead woman's research and the specific brilliance of 2 people who refused to accept that a conclusion was inevitable until they'd examined every alternative, he thought that combination was going to be enough. He was 16 years old. He had been fighting this war since before he could walk. He had lost people who mattered more than he could put into language, and he had decided that the losses were fuel rather than weight, and the decision had held. He was, Kingsley had written, preparing to win it. That was, Harry thought, precisely correct. Across the table Neville caught his eye and gave him the small, direct nod of someone who has made a decision and intends to see it through. Harry nodded back. Tomorrow, then. Tonight, food, and the ordinary noise of people who had decided to be on the same side, and Hedwig asleep on her perch upstairs, and the second report delivered and the record made honest and the long, complicated business of preparing to be exactly where you needed to be when the moment arrived. Harry finished his dinner. He was ready.